Hello and welcome to the third episode of Orthodoxy, Autocracy and Nationality. Today we are going to be talking about the transformation of the Roman Empire from east to west, so from west to east rather, from Rome to Byzantium. Very lucky to be joined by Columba as always. Hello.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm well. I've been my head's a bit jumbled. We have many similar names to go over in this one, but apart from that, I'm doing well.
Yes, it is going to be quite confusing to people in terms of us trying to illustrate the broad chronology for this evening, but hopefully people will understand what we're talking about. Also joining us again is our recurring guest, Marcus Pertinax. How are you?
Excellent, thank you very much, and good evening, everyone.
Sorry, I'm just dealing with a couple of problems relating to the slideshow. For some reason, it keeps showing up on the third slide and not the first one. So just give me a second. Probably a good place to start for this discussion will be defining our term. So obviously, on this long sort of series of episodes on this channel, I have already included a episode on the Empire of Constantinople, starring Semiagog and Pharaoh. So what is this conversation exactly? Well, this is focusing on the very specific area of history, which is the transformation of the Roman Empire from the Imperium Romanum into what we have in Greek known as the Basileia Romaion. Marcus, would you like to elaborate on what that means exactly?
Yes, I have a nice little introduction here for the audience, if they would so like. The way I've defined the empire is as such. What we call Byzantium, but more accurately, Basileia Romaion, was in essence the political remnant and legitimate successor to the imperial Rome of antiquity. It was, however, a very different creature that had emerged from the Dark Ages and did so with distinctive characteristics. It was the Greek-speaking portion of the Old Empire, often termed the East Roman Empire, that had survived its Western counterpart and had mostly maintained an effective and complex Romanesque structure of administration and governance.
Yeah, I think that's the pretty solid definition, because the prime difference is, of course, the Greekness of the Eastern Empire, right? And when we see this, and this is something we're going to bring out. I mean, in our last stream, we covered Macedonian kingship and this distinction between Eastern and Western conceptions of rulership. And what we see is that, and we began to briefly touch on it in the last stream, but we see these Greek ideals and these Greek concepts increasingly take over the empire, even before they formally split and the West is lost. This process begins much earlier, and I think that's going to be an important thing to highlight here.
Yes, the other main feature, of course, being the Christianization of the Roman Empire,
yes,
which formally happens before we have the split into East and West. Nevertheless, the remnant is going to carry on this tradition, and so the Christian nature of the empire is also going to be inseparable from. I'll talk about definitions when it comes to this discussion. So, in terms of like a starting point for this discussion, one could start with the ministry of Jesus back in the the 20s AD. However, so we are more sort of historically focused on the Christianization of the Roman Empire, and to avoid the stream obviously becoming too long, we're going to start off with ante-Nicene Christianity, so beyond the age of the apostles, which traditionally comes from the date of the death of John in 100. So do any of you have any sort of opening remarks with regards to the Christianization of the Roman Empire from 100 to 325?
I mean, the one I'm not an expert on this, but I will say that one very obvious thing, and you can see even from this map, is obviously it spreads from the east first. That's clear, because if you look at the areas that are more deeply entrenched in the earlier period, there's far more in the east. But another important thing to note here is it takes off in urban centers, which is something that we've discussed here before. I mean, you can look at modern day France. You can see the dark blue area is Massalia, which we've talked about. It was a big colony, and so that's how these things work, because I mean, people who were traveling and exchanging ideas, you would end up in cities, and you see Carthage in Africa there, and that's, of course, I mean, that's where the word pagan comes from, right? Because it means sort of people who dwell in the country or outside.
Yes, and indeed, the first dissemination of Christian materials was, of course, through the Koine Greek dialect, and this is where we get the origin of the New Testament. In terms of establishing some early church fathers beyond the apostolic, the original apostles of Christ, we have Pope Clement, we have Ignatius of Antioch pictured here in his martyrdom, which by Eusebius of Caesarea is traditionally dated around 108, the date during the reign of Trajan. However, its modern association has it later, about 140. We also have Polycarp of Smyrna, Clement of Alexandria, etc. The significant thing about all of these church fathers is that during this period we have the consolidation of what we know in the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church as apostolic succession, and the rise of the Great Church, which would later become the official Roman Church of Christianity. And so, including also the consolidation of a canon of the New Testament. Ignatius is also responsible for the practice of limiting the Gospels to 4. In terms of, we also have a major change in the fact that Jewish traditions had, long been deeply associated with the early Christians, and so we see this detachment from the old Jewish laws and Jewish traditions to some extent, and the creation of a new Christian cult, as it were. But
it is born out of the old, because I mean, what's the word? The Septuagint. I can never pronounce it. But the first books which were translated from the Hebrew into Greek, that was done around, I think, the 200s BC, again in the East. And again, we see Ignatius, he was from Antioch, which, as we know, was one of the great capitals of the Hellenistic East.
In the Acts of the Apostles, Antioch is cited at the first designation for actual self-described Christians as well.
Yeah, so it has I guess what I was trying to say is I agree with you in terms of that there is that break, but the new community is very much born out of the old.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I'm just I'm talking about sort of novel innovations and creating a new community as opposed to just an extension of the Jewish community. In terms of expansion, I believe it's sort of estimated that during the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, we have a rate of about 40% growth in Christian communities every decade. So there is a monumental growth, and as you can see by the little pockets in this graph, especially around Greek areas, there is a vast dissemination of Christian communities throughout. And the first sort of images of Roman art, for example, we have in the Roman catacombs. Again, the Cairo is a very early Christian symbol. We also have the emergence of Christian monasticism. So in Egypt, of course, you can also see the emergence of Christian communities in Egypt.
People like Saint Jerome
and Antony the Great begin the great tradition of monastic tradition. So moving on from this, can anyone sort of explain how the Christian church was able to expand so rapidly in a multifaceted, a multi-religious, but also polytheistic, principally civilization that was Greco-Rome?
There are a couple of things. I mean, the first answer that comes to mind is God's providence, right? Which is, he wanted this to happen. That would be my answer. But if we're being more historical, I suppose I can come at it from a history of ideas perspective, right? Which is ever since Aristotle and Plato, you've had because although this is a polytheistic society, we must understand that a lot of the earliest uptakers of Christianity came from learned people. Some people were quite well to do who were into Hellenism, right, and Hellenistic philosophy, which again was very popular in the East. And we see things like there's a difference, right? I mean, Aristotle and Plato, in their discussions about the conception of the divine, is very different from, say, Homer. I mean, they say ho theos. They talk about the god, and the prime mover. And so there's already a sort of a sympathy through the use of reason for the idea of a single god, who has created everything. And I would say that this is the sort of base that Christianity could build itself upon. It seems like it was almost laying the way. In terms of how it spread so rapidly, I mean, it is remarkable, isn't it? I mean, if you consider that, from Jesus's ministry, you have 12 apostles, and by the time you get to the 400s, there are tens of millions of Christians all over the Mediterranean. It is fascinating, and nobody has a sort of conclusive explanation for some natural explanation for the rapidity.
The Nietzschean explanation is slave morality, the fact that Christianity could offer salvation on a universal scale in a way that Greek polytheism couldn't. That's not to say, the concept of salvation and resurrection didn't exist. And this is why I think there is a lot of melding of ideas. So, for example, within, Greek Greek understanding, of course, we have metempsychosis with Pythagoras. We have the concept of anastasis, resurrection in Greek. And even in Greek mythology, I believe Asclepius and Thetis were resurrected after having been killed. And of course, in Rome, you have the concept of, the Elysian fields as well. This paradise after death, this idea that the body is not the end, that there's the immortality of the soul. So I think wedded to these, already prevalent ideas, it's sort of no wonder that Christianity would have so many sort of early adherents. Also,
in that sense, I don't know if I agree with you there, because yes, there is a conception of the afterlife, right, for the pagans, the traditional pagans, not the sort of Hellenists, because their beliefs on the afterlife are quite hard to pin down. But in terms of the sort of pagans that we all think of, we have places like Elysium, sure, but if you read the myths, Elysium is a place reserved pretty much for people who fulfilled that very strict classical ideal.
Exactly. And that actually helps my point, because it's more the expansion of this to make it a universal religion, as opposed to a religion confined to a certain group, which is why Christianity has that edge on traditional polytheism.
There's
also
something else worth adding to that.
Yeah, sure.
I was just going to say, in a sort of chronological context, is that there's also the circumstances in which the rise of Christianity occurs within the empire. In that, to quote Edward Gibbon, the sort of period from Augustus to, you might say, the end of the end of the reign of Commodus is considered the happiest time in history in a historical context, and really, from that point onwards, Rome enters the crisis of the third century, or the decades prior to the crisis of the third century, and then the crisis really ramps up in its severity. And a lot of these communities and cities are exposed to the worst elements of it. And at this time, this sort of message of redemption, of the Christian fundamental, principles that you and Columba have already outlined, that are attractive to, you might say, the masses. These things occur almost in unison at the same time. So there's a circumstantive consideration to be had there as well.
Well, you could say it helps advance Christianity further, because ironically, before then, you were talking about the Pax Romana. It is the Pax Romana that allows this travel throughout the Roman Empire, which establishes all of these communities, and it is the crisis which engorges those communities which have been set up during the Pax Romana.
And you might say galvanizes them as well.
So also we have the development within the Christian church as well. So we, like I mentioned, ecclesiology, the tendrils of what we would later, know as the fundamental foundations of the church. So we have the office of the episkopos, meaning the bishops or the overseers, the elders, the presbyterioi, and the deacons, meaning servants, the diaconoi, in these centers of urban Christian populations. But also we have the emergence of heresy as well. And so in opposition to heresy, of course, we have Tertullian's prescription against heresies, and Irenaeus of Lyons against heresies. This is again all after the period of Ignatius of Antioch. And just to give you like a reference point for these various heresies, we have, of course, Gnosticism, which, as far as I'm aware, focuses more on the personal spiritual knowledge of the believer rather than adherence to hierarchy or the church.
I mean, it varies. There are
Absolutely.
multiple
This is
variations.
like a huge church, a broad church, so to speak.
A broad church, yeah. I mean, that might be a bad word to use in
yes,
this particular
exactly.
context, but I mean, yeah, there's a lot of really weird stuff with Gnosticism. I mean, that's where, if I'm not mistaken, that's where this idea of if you've ever heard of a demiurge, it's this idea. And this is the belief of the monophysites as well. They're sort of interlinked in some sense that the God of the Old Testament is the evil God, and the God of the New Testament is a good God. Or there's a God that has created the world to entrap humanity and hide from them the real God. And so there are all these sort of bizarre traditions. I mean, some of which actually still persist. I mean, if you've heard of the Yazidis in the Middle East, I was reading about this today. They have a religion like this, with these sort of similar beliefs where they believe, in Muslim tradition, they believe that Satan was supposed to kneel to man and he refused. Well, the Yazidis, their traditional religion, their traditional take on that holds that Satan agreed with God to kneel, to sort of test man and give man free will, which there's all these bizarre arguments. They're interesting to read about, though. But
yes,
they all begin to take off in earnest at this time.
I think, though, you're talking more about Marcionianism rather than the Monophysites, because the Monophysites aren't that exciting in terms of like a division. It's again.
Oh no, I'm thinking of the Manichaeists. Yeah, with the
Manichaeanism.
I think so. Yeah, the Monophysites. They were the ones who had disagreements about the essence of Christ, right?
Yes, similar to the Arians.
Yes.
So moving on from this, now we get to the persecutions. Like, how do the Romans initially react to Christianity? Well, of course, during the Apostolic Age, we have the persecution under the Emperor Nero, probably a scapegoat for the Great Fire of Rome. But in terms of like later persecution, there was seldom a systematized system of persecution throughout the Roman Empire. Really, and I believe under Trajan there was even some tolerance, which is why it's quite controversial to put Ignatius of Antioch's death during the reign of the Emperor Trajan, and that's why more modern historians tend to put it much later.
Yes, I mean, my take on this would be it depends on who you ask, because if you read sort of people like Gibbons say, they will say, it wasn't that bad, it was overblown, and even later during Diocletian the numbers are overblown. And I think they are overblown to some extent, but I mean, you mustn't ignore the fact that Christians were treated poorly, and I feel like there's this sort of strain of minimization of the persecutions, which seems to coincide exactly with the rise of certain Enlightenment ideals, shall we say.
So in terms of, again, the actual increase in persecution, you mentioned, Marcus, that we have this galvanization during the crisis of the 3rd century. And this is where we have the first really comprehensive attempts to stamp Christianity out. So we already have the massive expansion of what it means to be a Roman citizen with the Antonine Constitution under the Emperor Caracalla in 212, which again, radically defines what it is to be a Roman citizen. And in addition to that, during the reign of Emperor Decius, who was one of the few effective emperors, although very short-lived, during the crisis of the 3rd century, we have this overall requirement to be part of the supplicatio to the imperial cult, i.e. give traditional ceremonies, sacrifices, and prayers to the imperial cult of Rome. And of course, by Christianity, any sort of Christian will tell you, there is only one God and you cannot worship any other gods. So the idea again of paying sacrifices to the old Roman gods was complete sacrilege.
But not only was it paying homage to the old gods, in many cases you're paying homage to the emperor.
The emperor himself,
and this is particularly,
the centrality of the imperial cult. Yeah.
I mean, the entire faith is built around God becoming man. And so it seems to me anyway particularly repugnant to then worship this monstrous earthly power in the same way. So yeah, I mean other and you see that all over in Christian tradition. Christians in Japan and what have you. But anyway, that's another conversation.
Yes, and this was very short-lived because Decius would die very soon afterwards. and he would be replaced by Gallienus, one of the longer reigning emperors during this period, who would rescind that policy, and there'll be a brief moment of tolerance until we have the emergence of Diocletian. And we'll get to Diocletian more in earnest, but just as it pertains to the Christians, the great Diocletianic persecution dates from about 303 to 312. He comes emperor in 284. So the significance of this is that he'd already spent the preceding years purging the army, which was really the only source of opposition to his authority, of all, prominent Christian elements. And only after that does he decide to issue edicts which revoke all of the privileges granted to Christians by Gallienus and reinstitute the supplicatio under Decius. And there's even a branch of Christians that sort of go along with this, and they're called the traditores. I'm not sure whether there's any link between traditor and the etymology of traitor. You'll have to fill me in on that. But nevertheless, there is persecution right up until the Edict of Milan in 313, which will establish tolerance for Christians. So unless anyone else has any sort of broad comments regarding Christianity, we'll probably go on to the crisis of the 3rd century.
Just to say, just because you immediately mentioned the point about the Diocletian persecutions, which arguably intensified under his successor Galerius, is that because of the setup of the Tetrarchy and the establishment of initially the 2 Augusti and then the 2 Caesars under them, there were almost different policies enacted in different portions of the empire at any given time when the Tetrarchy is actually set up.
Oh yes, it depended on the enthusiasm of the emperor. I mean, Galerius, for example, I think was quite activistic, but Constantius Colorus, who was the father of Constantine, had a much more moderate policy, which again was reflected in the fact that his son would later embrace Christianity. So moving on to the crisis of the 3rd century. Columba, before we came on, you were talking about the oriental shift in the nature of the emperor beginning in the Severan dynasty. Do you want to embellish on that point before we get to the crisis proper?
Sure. So I mean, the first thing to note, of course, is the Severan dynasty, who came to power after the wars after Commodus dies. So they're a new dynasty, and they came from Africa, right? The province of Africa. So Carthage, Tunis, that area. And so there's this sort of and they came from a sort of prominent family there, that mixed with a Roman settler family, say, but they still had this fond attachment, especially in the more provincial parts of the family, because the Severan family wasn't just Severus and his sons in Rome, who were really engaged. They had relations all over the place. There was this deep attachment to these strange sort of Semitic or Phoenician older rituals, which had been seeping into Rome for a long time. I mean, I talked last time about how in the Punic Wars, the Romans brought the Magna Mater, the great goddess from the east, and then you had the Galli priests who would castrate themselves, and there's all these bizarre traditions brought in, and these are all coming from the Levant or North Africa, and so you sort of see Rome being conquered by these things that it's conquered, as we've talked about. But during the Severan dynasty, they come from Africa, and so they're really into this. There's some, Dio and a couple of other sources talk about Caracalla in particular. I mean, Severus seems to have tried to, the first claimant to the title, seems to have tried to have stuck to his Romanness as much as possible. But Caracalla, his son, in his confidence, he's the one who issues the edict granting citizenship to everyone. And I believe Cassius Dio even says that this came about because he himself was of 3 races, and he also talks about the fact that Caracalla gave in to his cruelty, no doubt a consequence of his Syrian race, Syria being just sort of a general word for the Levant at that time. So then Caracalla is killed. And then Julia Mesa, I believe, or Julia Mesa, who is a relation from the sort of, again, the more provincial side of the family in the Levant, the Severan family. And she has a son who becomes the emperor. He's brought into Rome after Macrinus, who was the sort of the guy who murdered Caracalla. He is then murdered, and Elagabalus is brought into Rome. And Elagabalus, when he was in Syria, was the high priest, even though he was sort of teenage boy, of the cult of Elagabal. And Baal, of course, it means Lord, but it has this sort of this connotation of Semitic gods, even child sacrifice, all these things for thousands of years, going back to the Akkadians and the Assyrians and such like. He even brings in quotes the god to Rome, in the form of a giant black meteorite. Apparently he danced in front of it, pulling the chariot that was on himself, and brought it into Rome. And so we see this sort of passionate enthusiasm for these rites. And again, it reminds one of today, where if some sort of minority comes into a country, they eagerly try and turn the institutions of the country, if they get power and influence, to reflect these things. It seems to happen very often. And so we begin to see these increasingly Semitic, Syrian, Phoenician traditions take off in Rome, to the horror of people like Cassius Dio and the senatorials. And from this, we seem to get a lot of these ideas of Sol Invictus and unconquered sun, which come later, because Elagabal is, also got translated as Helio, Gabalus. So there's this idea of the sun and sun worship. So all these things seem to start earlier, and it even sort of becomes a legitimating force in the dynasty, because interestingly enough, there was a rumor started by Julia Mesa that Elagabalus was Caracalla's illegitimate son, and so he's trying to again link this all together. But yeah, that all begins to take off in earnest at this time. And also we even see it in the Praetorian Guard again. It used to be recruited from Italians. At this point, it's filled with Africans and Syrians who bring their own cults and what have you. So yeah.
So yes, what we're emphasizing is the de-emphasizing of a specific Roman ethnicity and the creation of this, for lack of a better word, ethnically integrated multicultural empire.
Diverse.
Well, there's also another function here too. We actually see this in the beginning of the golden period of Rome, where Rome, as it did in Italy really early in its history with the initial Latin colony, Rome sort of at the end of the two triumvirates and leading into the beginning of the imperial era, set up a large number of colonnae on the perimeter of the empire. And sort of what you see is initially there's a lot of whether it's slaves, whether it's the word I'm trying to think of, like riches from the areas that they sacked, or the territories they conquered. They brought in riches and wealth and slaves and what have you from outside of Rome and into Rome. But then what you sort of see is with the establishment of these colonnae around the empire, and interestingly you mentioned the Severans, because they came from North Africa, that there's quite a number of these cities that exist in Africa where Roman citizens and Roman veterans have been set up in these colonnae, and then you see this sort of effervescence of this sort of sprouting of roots of Roman civilization on the perimeters of the Roman world, and most famously in Italica, which is where Trajan and Hadrian came from in southern Spain, which is near modern day Seville. You have these settlements in Africa, for instance, such as Timgad, and I think Circa and Tavesta are these cities sort of either originally set up or refounded as Roman colonnae, and then these the sons of these colonies essentially end up coming back to Rome as captains in the army, as senators, as emperors in many instances. There's this sort of interesting back and forth effect.
Yeah, and like I said, the situation that I talked about with the Praetorians, it sort of symbolizes this, that many of these old these older institutions say that, even as the empire, even as, say, the plebs are becoming increasingly Easternized, these things had still at least been reserved for, an older Roman citizen. But yeah, in the century leading up to the time of Severus, we begin to see that breakdown. You still have, again, people like Dio in the Senate, but they're becoming increasingly irrelevant.
Correct. So yes, moving on.
And Dio himself is a Greek, but
yes. And again, Greekification is going to be a major component of this discussion as well.
Yeah.
But we're half an hour in, so we've got to move on. So the crisis of the 3rd century begins with the toppling of this dynasty, with the assassination of Severus Alexander, the Syrian, in 235. And during the next 49 years, so from 235 until 284, there are 26 emperors. Most of them are barracks emperors, so emperors who have been acclaimed by the army. And so correspondingly, we have a major diminution of the usefulness and even the legitimacy of the Senate, as it becomes basically a bystander through most of these affairs. As we already talked about, the decline in the caliber of senators. By 268, the empire had actually split. In addition to all these barbarian invasions that you can see on this map, by 268, Gaul and Britannia and parts of Hispania had broken out to form the Gallic Empire. And in the east, Syria and Egypt had formed the Palmyrene Empire under Zenobia. And it was really under the remarkable leadership of Aurelian, the restorer of the world, that both of these empires are conquered within the space of a very short reign of 5 years. And then he is, from a historical point of view, executed murdered by his own troops due to basically a misunderstanding. And that
I would argue that it's more significant than that, because I believe you had a freedman of his, Nero, who had committed some crime, but it was pretty minor. But Aurelian had a reputation, which I suppose was perhaps necessary to do what he did and restore the empire. But he had a reputation for real cruelty. He would not brook any disobedience, and he would brutally punish anyone. And so Nero became terrified, and so he spread this story: we're all going to be punished, and they murdered him. And I would say that this is very important because it's a sort of microcosm of the larger problem, which is that you have people like freedmen, say, who are not Romans, but are now intelligent enough, cultured enough, and well versed enough within the system to engage very freely within the system. And then they want independence, they want their own rights, they want what have you. And the only recourse for the emperors to retain control in this new situation, this new, more developed situation, is to be more cruel.
Yes, I'm not sure whether emperors were necessarily more cruel. I mean, Tiberius was known as, an incredibly harsh taskmaster when he was a Roman general. That we can't all sort of be this civil sort of moralizer like
no,
Augustus.
but I mean, if you read about the kind of things that, say, Galerius did, where we need taxes, because he's desperate for money. He can't tax anyone, and so he just puts out an edict demanding that everyone hands over like a set amount of their income. And if you don't hand it over, or if you're suspected to be hiding your income, you will be tortured until you reveal it. And things. And it's not that every single emperor is like this in this period, but things like this become increasingly common because things become increasingly tyrannical.
There's almost a necessity for severity, you might say.
Yes, and I don't deny, by the way, that the earlier emperors could commit acts just as cruel. And personally speaking, they were extremely cruel, just as cruel. But in terms of the cruelty of the system as a whole, I would say it got even worse in this period. I would say.
Yes, and so he's murdered in 275, and there is a brief period where you have the rise of Carus, who establishes a brief dynasty, but then he is assassinated. Well, this is basically assumed he's assassinated whilst campaigning against the Sassanians. And he puts his two sons, Numerian and Carinus, on the throne. Numerian dies very quickly, and he's replaced by Diocletian. And then Carinus fights a war against Diocletian, but is ultimately defeated, making Diocletian the overall emperor of the Roman Empire. Now, just to get back on like an epilogue about the crisis of the 3rd century, why it's so significant, not only did you have the physical dismembering of the empire and its reunification, not only did you have the empire descend into, constant civil strife, emperor after emperor, not only did you have religious strife, the expansion of Christianity and then the corresponding persecution of the Christians, but you also had major economic changes as well and cultural changes. So we have the collapse of the Pax Romana, which had been the happy situation of the Roman Empire from the beginning of Augustus, to you can say to the end of the Severan dynasty, even though some people put it to the end of Commodus, where you had a successful internal trade work and the Roman road system, which meant that trade was very accessible throughout the empire. And as a result, you have this process of economic decentralization, and this, almost say, you did the decline of the city, decline of the Roman urbs.
Well, I mean, there are multiple reasons. I mean, one reason, of course, is the increasing debasement of the currency, which again the emperors have to respond to with cruelty. Aurelian tries to call in all of the debased coins of his predecessors, and
again, this hurts
it won't
trade,
work.
It hurts trade as well, of course. If
yes, because there's so much fighting. Nobody can import or export, and you get starvation, you get famine. It's a disaster.
So the principal resource, of course, becomes food. So agriculture, achieves some sort of primacy during this period, and this is where you have the rise of the basically, local manufacturing and house economies. And you can almost say that this is a precursor to the manorial system that you have at the beginning of the Dark Ages, more developed with the feudal system in the medieval ages. In addition to that, as I mentioned, we have the decline of the urbs. Many urban dwellers actually sort of surrendered much of their rights to actually become protected by these landowners, and they would become colony. Traditional Roman citizens would basically opt into the system where they would get protection, they would get a job, they would get food in return for working on this land, and eventually these positions would become hereditary. And as you can see, there is the precursor element in that, in the system of feudalism.
Yes, and the sort of system of yeomanry, perhaps.
And with the cities themselves, the cities decline in size and they become walled as, fortification during civil wars or barbarian attack becomes a much more sort of urgent problem. Revenues fall. And as you mentioned, with the increasing severity, the expenses of actually maintaining this empire rise. So as a result, we see these far more draconian, arbitrary effects of the barrack emperors. However,
the quality of the military,
yes, exactly,
falls as well.
And this has been, starting even earlier with the Marcomannic Wars, where the barbarians relative to the Romans have been improving. But another very important thing, as we're talking about the creation of the Byzantine-Romain or Byzantine Empire for shorthand, even though people will still be frustrated with me using that term just for shorthand, the East becomes far wealthier comparative to the West. So during this time, Egypt and Africa, I know Africa still isn't included in the East, nevertheless, it does become detached pretty early on with the Vandal invasion, becomes relatively quite wealthy. It even sort of improves economically during this period. And Anatolia, despite being attacked many times, there is no sort of noticeable economic decline in this region. So whilst you have a destabilization in the West, you have a comparatively stable situation in the East, especially after the Palmyrene Empire is very quickly reincorporated into the Roman Empire. So here we see the focus moving from the West to the East, which is the wealthier part of the empire. And this is going to play a large part in Diocletian's regime, which we'll go on to now. So Diocletian is principally known for the Tetrarchy. And what we mean by the Tetrarchy is this creation of co-emperors to rule alongside and govern the empire. So as you can see in this map, Diocletian established himself as the principal Augustus, and he rules in Nicomedia, which is just opposite modern-day Istanbul. Whereas he has a co-Augustus in the West and a co-Caesar who has a co-Caesar in the West, and he has a co-Caesar in the East. So with the creation of 4 emperors, 2 principal Augustuses, and 2 junior Caesars. In terms of the creation of that system and like what it means, during the reign of Augustus, we had the notion of the fact that the Roman emperor is first among equals. He is primus inter pares. Diocletian redefines that concept to mean that he is primus inter pares compared to the other Roman emperors, and that the Roman emperors themselves are now considerably haughtier and aloof and autocratic and have no sort of need to treat the Romans as anything other than subjects.
Yes, we
And
might
this is
we might say that the mask is thoroughly off in this period.
Yes, and this wasn't, you know, this had been happening before, as you mentioned. This is I consider a process rather than a revolution. For example, Carus, as I mentioned, he decided not to even bother with a Senate confirmation. It's even controversy as to whether Diocletian even visited Rome during his reign to get the formal Senate approval for this. So in terms of coming up with a source of legitimacy for his reign, as we talked about, you have the senatorial emperors, then you have the barracks emperors, and now he decides to elevate himself to basically a divine appointed ruler. And this is the idea of dominus, meaning master and god.
Yeah.
And this had started earlier when in 287, Diocletian adopted the title of Jovius, which basically means in the manner of Jove, meaning, of course, Jupiter, that he would rule in the manner of complete mastery, and that his deputy, in the case of his first deputy, was Maximian, would be a Heraclius, i.e., you know, the son of Jove, and a heroic subordinate, you know, fighting off the barbarians.
Yeah, I think this was a very opportune way to sort of express the way that their rulership worked, because Maximian sort of handled a lot of the military side of things, and Diocletian the administration.
Also,
Exactly.
it's worth mentioning too that initially, to at least our understanding, it's initially established as a diarchy, as a rule of two. But with the rebellion of, I think it's Carausius in Britannia, where Maximian loses the greater part of his navy and the control of the Britannic legions, Diocletian dispatches, I believe it's Constantius Chlorus, Constantine's father, to suppress the rebellion. And he's made all too well aware that the rule of two is not enough. It's not, if one Augusti has to go east or west to support the other emperor, there's no one left to cover the exposed part of the empire. So then he's more or less comes to the conclusion that a rule of four must be, where there is the two senior and two junior emperors.
Yes, and moving on from that.
I mean, no, sorry, there's one more point that I would make, of course, and that's that even if you go back to the Severan dynasty and earlier, this term with the Augustus and the Caesar, this does come from earlier, because I mean, even in the Principate, the Augustus would of course be the ruling emperor, and then Caesar was a designation for your heir. In this period, we see Caesar change to an administrative role that is inferior to the Augustus, as opposed to just designating an heir.
Yes, exactly. Co-emperors weren't rare during this point. So, for example, Marcus Aurelius would have two co-emperors, Lucius Varus and his son Commodus. So this isn't a complete invention, but rather this is a formal system employing the use of Caesars. In terms of, again, why this is so significant for the change of the Roman Empire into what will become the Byzantine Empire, for lack of a better word, we have the complete removal of any sort of real significance for Rome other than that of a symbolic significance. So the capitals become Trier, they become Milan, they become Sirmium in modern day Serbia, and they become Nicomedia, moving all sort of administrative and military functions away from the capital. Even though he doesn't get rid of the Praetorian Guards, which have been so decisive in various coups, the Praetorian Guards remain in their barracks in Rome, and again, because of the significance of Rome itself is declining, so too the Praetorian Guards.
Do you not have the because we've had the prefectures during this time which get expanded, do they not? Because I mean this is something that I feel like we might have missed, but in the crisis of the 3rd century, because of as you say, the emperors were barely in Rome, they were soldier emperors. Isn't that when the role of the Praetorians increase and they become a sort of like we've talked about, they have a sort of expanded role?
Well, I think in terms of the sources that I've consulted for this, the consensus was that the actual prefect's position was key for Diocletian's power, i.e. that he would appoint various prefects, which he had complete trust in. However, the actual role of the guard itself declined. So it was more, again, a transformation of the administrative role as opposed to the role of a bodyguard, which had
Yes, but
previously
there were
established.
there were other important sort of changes at this time, as you say, because you had the importance of the Praetorians, but as the Praetorians become more mobile under people like Severus, they accompany him on campaign in the north, but then they come back to Rome and they're sort of relocalized there. But as there are increasing troubles in the empire, there is this increasing need to become more totalitarian, we might say. And of course, you need your SS, you need your Stasi, you know. And if the Praetorians are in Rome, then they need to be sort of supplanted, and that's basically what happened. If you look at what happens under the reign of people like Diocletian, and this is actually something that people should note well, new organizations aren't created. Instead, the organizations that already exist, certain organizations are expanded. And two really good examples are the you have the speculatores, and speculatores were originally a detachment of troops attached to a legion whose job was to reconnaissance, basically. They would go out at night and spy on the enemy camp or the landscape or what have you. And then you also had the frumentari, who were originally started off as men assigned to go and appropriate grain from people and things like this, and eventually they get a great role because of their knowledge. So these things, I suppose, begin to expand, and that might explain why definitely towards the later emperors, Diocletian and later Constantine, the importance of the Praetorians becomes less and less.
Yes. Also, there's another thing to consider here as well at this point in time, and this I'll be brief, AM. During this time where Diocletian restructures the empire fundamentally and sets up these dioceses, we can see here Gallia, Italia, Pannonia, Moesia, etc., is he nearly trebles the number of actual provinces in the empire. He breaks apart the large provinces and makes a large number of smaller provinces.
Yeah.
To which end he then sets up a dualistic governance system so that governors themselves don't hold military control. The provinces themselves are governed by what the Romans called praeses, which sort of means the head of, and they're a civil head of the province. But the military command of each province is commanded by a dux, which sort of will evolve into the medieval duke. And another thing is also we also have a fundamental change in the army, and those who listen to our previous videos we've sort of touched on the Roman knack of always being willing to update and always willing to change and to adapt to evolving situations. And this is where you have the eventual breakaway during this period between Diocletian and Constantine, this breakaway from this fundamental standard, you might say, the GI of the ancient world, which is the Roman legionnaire, and this breaking up into the limitani, or the what the Romans call the limitani repensis, the frontier troops,
and the comitatenses,
the comitatenses armatus, which are the heavy like rear troops. And also, I mentioned before when we spoke about the decline of the Roman financial system, this is where also the number of troops between sort of Aurelian and Constantine, you have this massive ramping up of the army from approximately 250, 80,000 to nearly double that number. And in some instances, it goes above that later on even. So it places a lot of stresses on the actual state itself, and you have a lot more troops and a lot less actual control and power in the hands of local governors. And so a lot of these changes are happening in a very short space of time.
Yeah, and they're extremely expensive, and it's not just the troops, right? I mean, one thing that you really see in the period between sort of Aurelian and Diocletian is a massive expansion in the state everywhere, from the army and these new divisions. You have these new divisions in the provinces with more administrators.
You have a swelling of the bureaucracy as well.
Yeah, the bureaucracy swells massively. I mean, Aurelian, you had the what are they called again? The frumentationes, which were the bread dole, the grain dole in Rome, which was free, but I mean, again, this links into this idea of morality and things becoming just increasingly disordered, and we might say socialistic or what have you. I'm not sure, luxurious. Aurelian in part to sort of further his popularity, he expands the dole so that it's not just even bread anymore. Now it's meats and things like this, meats and olive oils and all these things which he's heaping on the people.
Welfare state just expands.
More welfare state, yeah, and this costs a vast amount, and then in the intervening period when you have Diocletian again, he's establishing the frumentari, the speculatores, these complex spy systems and spy networks. But also, I mean, some estimates are that he enrolled something like 20,000 in a new imperial bureaucracy, and many of the people at the top are all cutting bits off the top and getting massive wages, and it's just it becomes this massive cost.
You could almost say, and I dislike using or hearing the word Byzantine being used as a pejorative, because I think it's extremely unfair to the empire and the people who controlled the empire and ran it and kept it alive for so long. But this is where you might say you see the Byzantification of the old Italic Roman system into something that's more complex.
Yeah, and I would
when I say
also
complex,
say,
I don't necessarily mean bad, but it's just it is made more complex.
Well, it's made more Byzantine, we might say.
Yes.
I mean,
just to make it even more complex. I mean, you mentioned the various governorships. I believe in some cases dukes would be responsible for multiple provinces, and on top of that system, you would also have vicarius, which in Latin means deputy, responsible for the administration of the diocese as well over the provinces. So yes, a lot of
and usually it was the vicarii also who commanded the comitatenses, because that'd have to be centralized.
and don't forget you have the Magister Officiorum and the Magister Urbis who controls Rome. So yeah, things are just it's almost as if devolution seems to just make things more chaotic. But use that information how you will. Audience.
Actually, one last point we have to consider too, because we've got the map here, and just before we lose the map, with the reforms of Diocletian too, it's the first time we see the province of Italia and the citizens of Italia being taxed. The only place that is exempt from this point on is essentially the metropolitan boundaries of Rome, the city of Rome. Everything outside of the walls of the Aurelian walls is taxed in Italy for the first time in the history of the empire.
It's a very big symptom again of Italy losing this special status as the heart of the empire,
Yes.
Yes, and I think you've covered most of the points I wanted to make about Diocletian, but one more, which is probably the counterpoint to this idea of complexity in administration, was that there was also this attempt to try and compile and codify all of the precedents in Roman law, and this again is a precedent we're going to see with Justinian later on. This attempt to codify and create a universal system of law throughout the empire. In terms of economic reforms, I do believe he tried to control inflation, but to no success.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to have been pretty much
price controls. No, in that, no, he didn't succeed. But what he does do is he established the solidus, which becomes the most intact currency.
It was Constantine who established the solidus.
Okay.
Sorry,
I thought it was Diocletian, but I might be mistaken. But either which way, whether it's the one or the other, all I want to say is that the solidus becomes a much more consistent and a much more respected currency than what happened to the denarii and the sestertii previously.
Sure, but I think if we look at his economic policy more generally,
they weren't that successful. No,
he spent more than he saved. Yeah.
Well, ironically, Diocletian and his reforms bring to bear one of the first instances of, as a state, you can't control prices, and sort of Keynesians take note, it doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, we see many things, and it's interesting because if you read some of the older historiography from, the turn of the 19th century, that sort of time, talking about even the earlier Caesarian party or some of the things here, the word socialist is tossed around. There is this idea that many of these measures we would identify as sort of socialist. And I guess that's a result of people in the 1800s and the early 1900s trying to illustrate through their work that these things didn't work and trying to
and obviously seeing it through their own prism too.
Of course. But I mean, there are some things which are very illustrative, and we people like Keynes should have been able to learn from. But definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the last comment I want to make is about the position of the emperor himself. So I've already mentioned this elevation to Dominus et Deus. In terms of like how this manifested, we have the replacement of the concilium, which means council, this idea that the emperor would work in tandem with the Senate, and it's replaced by the consistatorium, which basically means the sacred audience of the emperor, the idea that the emperor is now this sacred object, which is, you know, beyond sort of the pale of any sort of his subjects.
And I believe again,
confirmation.
Sorry. I was just going to say, in coins at this time, I believe you begin to see the emperors wearing a sort of a diadem, which is a classic.
You can see it in the picture here. Is this creation of the Golden Diadem, especially?
Oh yes, of course. Oh, I see. Yeah, I've always been a little bit confused about this bust. I could never really identify it, but yeah, now that you mention it, it does look like jewelry, doesn't it?
And again, among other things, of course, we have the adoratio, or the prostration in the presence of the emperor, and among other things that will become established elements of not just Byzantine monarchy, but monarchy in general, is the idea of proskonesis, meaning the kissing of the hem of the robe. All of these elements are introduced formally during the reign of the Emperor Diocletian, including sumptuary laws, which ban anyone other than the emperor from wearing purple. So again, it's just a further consolidation. Probably the one element missing in terms of the creation of a recognizable autocratic monarchy is, first of all, of course, we have the Christianization, which will happen later, but the principle of dynastic succession, because Diocletian himself did not have any male children. He only had a daughter, I believe. So he had to rely on military lieutenants governing the empire for him. And so invariably, because he couldn't rely on his own family, I believe he held most of the children of those emperors in Nicomedia with him as basically hostages. I think this was the case with Constantine the Great himself.
Yes, he stayed with them for something like 2 years, I believe.
So we don't have the system of dynastic succession established yet, but we will have it established under the next emperor, which of course is Constantine. So does anyone want to give like a little introduction to why Constantine is so significant?
Can I just say one brief thing about the slide before? Because again, there is this idea that we explicitly associate Greekness with the new, you know, Hellenistic kings, or this new trend influencing Rome. But I would say, I mean, hark your minds back, audience, to when we were talking about Alexander demanding prostration from his men, and his men who were Greeks rejected this because this was an explicitly Eastern custom. So what I would say is, this is not explicitly Greek what is happening. I suppose there's more sort of older Eastern traditions being funneled through this Hellenistic lens, then onto the emperors. I just wanted to make that point.
Incredibly important point to make.
I do have a couple of choice quotes, if I may, that I think reflect the type of individual Constantine was, if you would like.
Sure.
Eusebius says, "In his earliest youth, the signs of imperial greatness were obvious in him. He was exceedingly able and ambitious for glory." Another thing to note as well at this time period, once the empire is stabilized under Diocletian and with the Tetrarchy, and then sort of later with Constantine coming to the fore. But prior to him becoming emperor, he actually accompanies Galerius on a campaign against the Sassanid Persians, and also I believe Galerius is the first emperor to campaign against over the Danube since the era of Aurelian. So this is indicative that the empire is able to take an offensive posture again. And there's actually an anonymous quote about Constantine in this campaign against the Sarmatians. And the quote is this: "When Constantine, then a young man, was serving in the cavalry against the Sarmatians, he seized by the hair and carried off a fierce savage and threw him at the feet of the Emperor Galerius. Then sent by Galerius through a swamp, entered it on horseback and made his way to the enemy, killing many and gaining the victory." So this is a young man who's in his 20s and already proving himself a very courageous and a very able leader of men.
Yes, but I mean, and we begin to see, pretty much as soon as he's winning victories, and he has power to propagandize them, I suppose. He's incredibly savvy, because you mentioned that he was part of that party that was one of the first to attack the East since Aurelian, and indeed we see Constantine constantly trying to hark back to Aurelian. And one way that he does this is, again, coinage is one of the most important forms of propaganda available to an emperor. That's why the mints were places of such political importance, because it's one of the main ways that you can get a message across, because everybody will see your coinage. And so when we see Aurelian celebrating his victories, we have Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, which is again drawing on these older, because he's not only saying I am unconquered, I'm militarily victorious, but he's directly linking himself back to the older Severan dynasty to legitimize yourself, which is a classic imperial tactic. You want to legitimize yourself by doing that. And with Constantine, again, we see in his coinage he draws on the same solar imagery, and Sol Invictus, he depicts himself with what gets a radiant crown, a solar crown. And so we see all of these same motifs. He even in some of the coins of members of his family and what have you from the time, there are some artistic liberties taken to with the shortcut beard and what have you, explicitly to make the emperors look like Aurelian, and you tend to see this when a great emperor comes along and stabilizes the empire for the next 50 so years or whatever. The next emperors will consciously try and link themselves to the great. We see it with after Trajan, when an emperor would be officially chosen by the Senate, they would say maybe as lucky as Augustus or as excellent as Trajan, and so he's harking back again,
Exactly,
yes,
right.
One point I actually forgot to mention about Diocletian was that he tried to effectively overshadow the achievements of Aurelian in terms of legitimating this new system. Basically, he wanted to create this link between him and Gallienus, and that all the intermediary emperors were essentially of little of note, and that the Tetrarchs themselves were the restorers of the world, as opposed to Aurelian trying to diminish that position he had. And so I think this is an interesting theme coming back to Constantine, is that we have, of course, the destruction of the Tetrarchy during the reign of Constantine. Just to give you a bit of context on that, he is, of course, the son of Constantius Chlorus, as we mentioned. And in terms of like the various usurpations, I believe it's Maxentius would make himself co-emperor in the West. And Constantine, believing that Maxentius was essentially a usurper of the proper order of the Tetrarchy, went on a campaign against him to take back the city of Rome and unite the western half of the empire. And this is where we have one of the most famous moments in Christian history, which is the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, whereby the legend goes, prior to the battle, you have a sign in the heavens, or some sort of meteorite or something along those lines. But the symbol, I think, is the symbol of the Cairo. Yeah.
The symbol of the cross, depending on
it depends on your interpretation.
Depends on interpretation.
And
in
also
hoc signo vinces.
Yeah, I was going to say either the Latin in hoc signo vinces or the Greek equivalent, which is Nika or something. I can't remember the exact phrase.
Nika something. I love that. That's good.
By this sign you will conquer. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, that because no one really knows, but yes.
So yes, and of course, Maxentius is defeated at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, and I believe Gallienus, who is the emperor in the east, would die in 311.
Yes, and, Eusebius records that Galerius, who was one of the cruelest emperors in this period, died horrifically of some sort of monstrous like bowel cancer or something wretched like that.
Yes. Yeah. And Licinius, I believe, will become the co-emperor in the east. And this situation, worked relatively, considering they also married. The family's married, I believe, Constantine's daughter, or was it sister? Was it
his sister?
Sister married Licinius. However, as we also previously mentioned, in the year 313, we have the Edict of Milan, which gives tolerances to Christians. And just to give a bit more context, Gallienus had also been rigorously persecuting Christians, for most of his reign. And now you have a major sort of changing imperial policy from the previous 10 years, which would be one of the most aggressive periods of Christian persecution in the empire's history. Now we have the formal tolerance of Christians, even though, important to note, Constantine will not convert until much later in his life for a myriad of reasons.
for the doubtful, we do see corroborations, right, of these stories. I mean, not long, again, minting, very, very good source. Not long after the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, we begin to see coins minted by Constantine that have the Cairo on the back, on the obverse side.
Yes, but again, it's depending whether this is again the major controversy regarding the historiography around Constantine, as to whether this was a genuine religious conversion or whether this was trying to appeal to the Christian population to support his rule.
A lot of people forget this point, but I mean, we know of Saint Helen. She's a rather celebrated saint in the Christian church, but when we talk about Constantine, often Saint Helena is kind of forgotten in the wash. I mean, Saint Helena is a really important figure in early Christianity, and what bearing did her being a Christian have on her son?
Yeah, I mean, lots of early figures seem to have been converted by the hectoring of their mothers. I'm pretty sure Saint Augustine was actually.
Oh yes, and you bring up a very genuine point: the idea that he was raised a Christian as well. So there is a lot of controversy regarding this point, and there isn't any sort of clear consensus. But
yes, because some say that his baptism really late was because he wasn't really sure, and others say it's because he believed that by getting baptized as late as possible, he could get as many sins sort of washed away as possible.
Yes,
right?
Which, from a spiritual perspective, makes sense.
Well, yes, I like also, it. I like his ambition.
Yeah, but also bear in mind that formal Christianity, as we know it, the Roman Church begins in 325 with the Council of Nicaea, which he convokes. And we're talking about early Christianity here. So we're talking about the development of the sacraments, the idea of continual penance through the sacrament of contrition and penance, confession, in other words, hasn't been established yet. So this idea of waiting for baptism right until the end of life makes sense within the Christian context at that time. So again, I'm not convinced either way as to whether he was, a dedicated Christian from the beginning. But what really matters in terms of what this produced, and he moved the capital. I finish off about Licinius because we got backtracked. Licinius is made coemperor in the east, and it is the persecution of Christians in the east, which is used as the casus belli, essentially, for Constantine to wage war on Licinius. And again, this substantiates the argument that Constantine's, either you can say that this substantiates Constantine's argument that there was a genuine religious conversion, or he's using Christianity again as a pretext to take control of the entire empire, which he does in
or possibly both.
Or possibly both, which he does in 324. And so from 324 until 337, he is the sole emperor of the Roman Empire. And this is the point I was alluding to originally, which is we have the destruction of the Tetrarchy and the creation of a new united empire under Constantine, who will eventually convert formally to Christianity. And it'll be through his sons, Constantius II and Constantine II, he will attempt to propagate his dynasty, even though the irony being that Julian will be the last one of his dynasty, which we'll get to in a bit.
And I think, but I think Constantine did sort of, I believe he also the Castra Praetoria in Rome. The fortress of the Praetorians, which had been there since the reign of Tiberius. I believe he dismantled it publicly and made a big show of it. Was that him? I believe that was him.
Well, the interesting thing with the Praetorian is you have an early instance of them being sort of unofficially disbanded, and then Diocletian greatly diminishes their role, and by the capital leaving Rome, their importance is diminished anyway. And then it's after the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, actually, of the units of Maxentius's army, it's only the Praetorians that don't break. And Constantine respects their bravery for having stood in battle, because the rest of Maxentius' troops fled across the Tiber, because it's in that fleeing across the Tiber Maxentius actually drowns and dies. I mean, Constantine doesn't kill him because Maxentius dies in the Tiber. But as a result of that, Constantine integrates the Praetorians into frontline vexellationes, frontline units. They're dispatched to the front. And the Castra is dismantled, like you say. So the Praetorians are just really destroyed here.
And I believe one of the sources does make reference to there being a sort of a show made of it. They put there was a celebration, and so Constantine being the very savvy politician, he's like, okay, I'm going to incorporate you into my vexellationes, but there's an opportunity for like, a great photo shoot here, a great political display, so
Well,
yeah, very
we
very,
have
very savvy guy.
we have to consider too, from the time that the Praetorian prefect plunged a gladius into Agrippina the Younger, the Praetorians have had a great hand in the massive destabilization of the empire for 150 years at this point. And so I dare say the Roman citizens who would have been aware of this notion, or certainly elements of its aristocracy and upper classes, would probably have sighed a relief at the end of this
Certainly, yeah.
endlessly troublesome unit of troops who were nothing but a hindrance to the empire.
The other point that I was going to make is because now we move on to the foundation of Constantinople, right? AM.
Oh yes.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that the sources state that when Constantinople was sort of founded again on top of Byzantium or near Byzantium, he actually, when you founded a city in ancient times, the augurs would come, the guy, ancient, you'd use ancient measuring techniques, and you would observe the flights of birds, and you would try and sort of, it would be an auspicious occasion. I'm pretty sure that Constantine, he brought the augurs, and the augurs were used to inaugurate the city and lay down the lines of the city. So yeah, Constantine, even in his later years, even in his most successful years, still very sympathetic and aware of the importance of these older pagan traditions. I believe he also allowed sacrifice, although there's some debate around whether he allowed sacrifice, I believe.
Well, there's the story about him being led around the perimeter of Constantinople, and he had spear in hand, and basically he traced the line of what would become the Constantinian Wall, which is the main city fortification prior to the Theodosian walls being built 150, 200 years later.
Okay,
just to elaborate on that point, other than the, obviously the inauguration, as you mentioned, Columba, why did he pick Constantinople as the site of his new capital?
Oh, are you asking? I mean, weren't there? I mean, like you said, Diocletian set up headquarters in Nicomedia, right, which is not far at all. So I think it had already. I mean, you see, Maxentius, Maximian, he doesn't live far from Diocletian in Nicomedia, and they're constantly communicating letters to each other, and the Caesars are going backward and forward, and so you get this impression that around this area, Nicomedia and Byzantium, around that the Bosporus, there is a power base being built up, a base of operations, if you will, that they can rule from effectively.
Well, it is an incredibly viable strategic location.
Well, that too, yeah. That's why they chose it, right?
It is basically a peninsula, and you have eventually you'll have the massive Theodosian walls,
very defensible,
on the west side, very easy defensible position, and it will withstand numerous sieges throughout its very long history.
And so I'd say Constantinople is a formalization of what was already there. Yeah.
If you want,
certainly.
Sorry,
Marcus, go ahead.
If the audience was a little bit of embellishment on this point and the history of the city itself, there is a episode with Semigog and Pharaoh from the original series, which covers the Empire of Constantinople. I've linked in the description if you just want a little bit of embellishment on that point, because we can't really go too much into detail on this specific stream. Yes, Marcus.
I was just going to say also there's a practical standpoint, because we often talk about the pragmatism of Roman leaders and the Roman state and of the Roman army to an extent, and Byzantium, as in the Greek settlement of Byzantium, which becomes part of the Roman Empire, I believe sides with Nicaea against Septimus Severus, and Severus attacks the city and more or less sacks it and destroys it, but in doing so realizes that Byzantium's actually a very strategic point. Like you say, it's a city on a peninsula, it straddles Europe and Asia, has the Bosphorus, it's a center of a very lucrative trade route, and has been really, we mentioned Byzantium in the Peloponnesian stream, so this isn't news to anybody. And Constantine crushes Licinius, or one of his armies. He defeats him not far from the city of Byzantium, and so what he would have understood is that even prior to this defeat of Licinius, that when the Goths, for instance, raided the empire early on, and in other incursions and other instances of civil war, the Byzantine city, in a much smaller state, was actually very defensible, was actually very much able to withstand attacks from numerically superior enemies, because even in a smaller size, it was a very defensible city. If you look at like a city map of Byzantine Constantinople. It has drawings of the smaller series of walls, and even the Severan wall and the Greek wall are still nestled amongst hills, and it's a very defensible. The city has a very defensible orientation in that respect, and so Constantine would have thought, okay, this empire it straddles Europe and Asia, it's close to the eastern frontier, it's close to the Danubian frontier. It's on a trade route. It's a defensible city. I am the master of the Roman world now.
But also, principally, as you mentioned with the Goths, it is within marching distance of the two then principal enemies of the empire, which were the Sassanians in the east and the Goths in the north.
Correct.
I would also
I think him realizing being master of the Roman world is he thinks to himself, I can essentially create a sandbox city, and does it.
Yeah, and how he does it, I believe it's Eusebius again. And if anyone wants to go and read this, it's the Church History by Eusebius.
Eusebius is a great read for this period. Just
he's great. He's great. And he's fun to read too. But yeah. So Constantine, I mentioned that there's some debate about sacrifices, but certainly he's not sort of actively persecuting pagans in an extreme way.
Oh no,
But what we do see, and Eusebius talks about this, that when he founds Constantinople, in order to sort of beautify it and provide wealth for all of his construction projects, he basically goes to places like Antioch, lots of the grand, old cities of the East, and just takes, statues and all sorts of treasures, and just takes them all to Constantinople. And so, although he's not as extreme as some later emperors, and with regards to the pagans, clearly, at least it seems, at this period, he did not have a lot of respect for the cult statues of pagan temples and such like. He would happily march in and take them, which I think tells you something about his religious leanings.
His actual inclinations as such, yeah.
So I'm just embellishing that point, just because I have to move on, if that's all right.
Of course, sorry.
Sure.
Of course, you can say the culmination of this religious leaning is the fact that he would also be responsible for the construction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which will become, one of the principal churches of Christianity. And in terms of you mentioned Columba, I think this stands in stark contrast to his successor, Constantius II, who ultimately is the victor of the various civil wars, Constantinian civil wars that plague the empire after his death. One of the weird idiosyncrasies of this period of, you can say, confusion in regards to the actual orthodox position of the church, despite the fact that Nicene Christianity and the Nicene Creed with it have been established in 325, is that Arian Christianity was incredibly prominent. And when it comes to Constantius II, as we established in our Julian the Apostate stream, Constantius was a semi-Arian, and he would, on his death, he would be deified as a god despite being a lifelong Christian. So all of these elements are persisting. But of course, I think the inauguration of persecution really happens under Constantius II.
I mean, he was still probably better than his brother Constans. I don't know if you've read about what Constans apparently gets up to, what Eusebius tells us, but he had an interesting private life, shall we say.
Indeed. The other thing too is just for Constantine, just very quickly, because I know Ian needs to move on, is that, for those who don't know, Constantine actually ends up killing his firstborn in a plot, Crispus, who actually accompanies him on many of his campaigns. And Crispus actually proves himself to be an able leader of men, quite a sound person for all intents and purposes. But Fausta, much in a similar in a similar note to Livia with Augustus, is quite inclined to have her actual children on the throne. And so there's some kind of a conspiracy, which frankly no one to this day really knows what happens. But Crispus, his firstborn, and Constantine's wife Fausta are implicated in a plot, and both are killed in a short space of time. Crispus is, I think, killed somewhere near Trieste, the Italian city of Trieste, and Fausta is strangled in a bath. And poor Crispus is actually condemned to damnatio memoriae. And very little exists of Crispus as a result of that. And that's actually one of the great tragedies of this period, when you look at the character Crispus is.
I believe there are some references to the possibility that Fausta and Crispus might have been
that's what they say,
sleeping with each other, right? Which would perhaps it would perhaps go some way towards explaining the the swiftness, severity of the killings, and then also the damnatio memoriae. Perhaps that would just. I mean, I don't know.
We'll never know. We'll never know.
We'll never know, probably.
It's interesting talking about the spirit. I hate to bring in, this isn't really relevant, but there's almost a exact parallel with Ottoman history, with the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, his son Mustafa, and his wife Roxolana.
Well, I mean,
actually, good point.
What is our theme here? Been here? I mean, we talked again about how this isn't just explicitly Greek. A lot of these things are deeper and seem to be built on not just Greek but the East. These administrative systems, and the Ottomans come in and take over this same system.
Exactly.
So yeah.
So without further ado, we move on. We've talked a bit about the intervening history. So just regarding the intervening history, obviously you mentioned Constantius II, Constantine. Again, what we see in terms of like a fundamental failing in the systems, that many modern monarchies, or when I mean modern, I mean relative to this, so medieval monarchies, we have the establishment of primogeniture. Primogeniture isn't established after the death of Constantine. Constantine II claims primogeniture, but he's basically outwitted and defeated by Constantius during the ensuing wars. After the death of Constantius, of course, we have the reign of Julian the Apostate, who will be the last pagan emperor. And we really don't have that much time to go into this, but if you really want a detailed breakdown of Julian the Apostate, Columba and I do have a stream on him. Suffice to say that he attempts to radically redefine what it is to be Christian, to be basically an extension of Judaism. He begins to import Greek traditions such as wearing the beard, adopting a very ascetic lifestyle, and begins this campaign in the East where he is defeated and has this ritualistic death again, corresponding to his sort of vision of the heroes of old. And after his death, we have a period of instability where the Constantinian dynasty and the unity of the empire under one emperor is temporarily broken. And we have I believe it's the Emperor Valens eventually in the East, and the Emperor Valentinian in the West. Valens will die as a result of the Battle of Adrianople, which we've talked about in a previous stream on a different series. But when it comes to the significance of Theodosius himself, he marries into the dynasty of Valentinian in the West, and through that he has an obligation basically to help the dynasty in the West. He becomes emperor in 379. In 380, he issues the Edict of Thessalonica, and this proclaims the Christianity as the state religion of the empire. So we already mentioned the fact that you have these weird pagan Christian idiosyncrasies through the reign of Constantine, through the reign of Constantius. Then we have this attempt of pagan revival under Julian the Apostate. So by the reign of early Theodosius, this process is over. Christianity has definitively won, and it is Orthodox Christianity.
Yeah, I mean, paganism is still holding out, like in the country and in some outskirts. It's not like it's non-existent. It is still there, but it's
victorious. Yeah. But in terms of we mentioned the persecution under Constantius, which basically including attacking and reappropriating the wealth of various temples. This intensifies again under Theodosius, but nevertheless, it's an unstable situation still. So we mentioned in our Julian the Apostate stream that there is one last hurrah for pagan tolerance under the usurper Eugenius in the West, who was defeated. Yeah. And with the defeat of Eugenius just 1 year before Theodosius, we have the stripping of the altar of victory to Actium, say, for example, in Rome. We have the dissolution of the Vestal Virgins in Rome. We have, again, more persecution aimed at polytheism and Hellenic religions, and
the academies are all shut down, right?
Yes, in particular, it's the Neo-Platonic Academy. I believe is shut. The Olympic Games are also banned, and there is also the destruction of the Temple of Apollo in Delphi and the Serapeum in Alexandria, which is basically the lesser of the great sort of Alexandria library. This isn't officially sanctioned, but it's allowed to go unpunished, essentially. Yes. So much of the aggressive Christianization of the Roman Empire takes place under Theodosius, even though Theodosius's reign is, as you can see, he temporarily united the empire and were divided at his death. It is basically a long history of civil wars. So I mentioned that he was married into the Valentinian dynasty in the West, and Valentinian the Great is probably considered the last great Western Roman emperor. There were very few, sadly. And after he dies, Theodosius is responsible for propping up his brother-in-law, Valentinian II. And it's finally, at the end of his life, he's able to unite the empires under his own personal rule. But in so doing, he has allowed the Gothic federati, of course, to have substantial influence and autonomy within the empire. I believe it's actually important to note that this actually began under Julian the Apostate himself, with the grant of this status to the Franks in modern-day Belgium, which is something we'll talk about later when we talk about our Frank series. So all of these, you can say the stable situation under Constantine, and just again to reaffirm, under Constantine, not only did you have the consolidation of the empire, not only did you have the creation of this new capital, not only did you have the tolerance towards Christians, but you had the recovery of the Agridecumatis and Swabia in his war against the Franks and the Alemanni, and we had the Sassanian War, we had the war against the Sarmatians. We actually had temporary gains in the province of Dacia, which Aurelian had abandoned in 271.
Yeah, he couldn't hold it.
So from that situation, we have this situation where the empire is united again under Christianity as its formal religion, persecuting paganism, but it's significantly weaker as a result of all these internal schisms. And as we see, we have the formal division into East and West, which is again why Theodosius is an emperor to note. And we have the borders, as you can see, of the Eastern Empire, which are basically going to remain stagnant like this, with a few alterations on the Eastern front against the Sasanian Empire, right up until the reign of Justinian. And this division is Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west.
Yeah.
Does anyone have anything to embellish upon this point, where we have the formal division of the empire and the formal Christianization of the empire?
Marcus?
What I will say is, because I think might have been in the German stream or the Italian stream, I can't remember which one, but I made a reference to the books by Edward Luttwak about the grand strategy of the Byzantine and the Roman empires, and I touched on the defensive depth of the two countries. I think in part, when you consider that Theodosius was ruling from Constantinople at this point, and if you look at that map, actually, this is a very good map to demonstrate this, that, you have this vast expanse of Gaul, and Gaul is separated by Hispania with the Pyrenees and what have you. I think Theodosius was probably of the mind that he could have afforded some leeway to grant these various Germanic tribes, the Franks, the Visigoths, etc., parcels of land and confirm their status as federati within the empire. Whereas if you look at the geography of the East, with the exception of Anatolia itself, there's no real expanse or defensive depth to be able to do this. And I think in essentially refusing to grant, aside from the failed experiment of the Goths, with the Valines and the Battle of Adrianople, but that as an aside, with the East Empire having done this, what you see is a much greater integrity of the empire at the provincial, the managerial level, at the defensive level, where you just don't have these large provinces, these large regions of the empire essentially being lumped off en masse. Because
I think part of that,
it cascades, like it's just unstoppable after a certain point.
I think part of that, of course, is the urbanization in the East relative to the West, right? I mean, of course, there are many cities in the West at this point, but again,
I'm speaking in very broad terms, obviously, but that's a very good point. Yes,
yeah,
you raised a very good point.
Like you don't have this same density, and you don't have this I suppose state machinery set up, but then again, I mean, you do have places like Egypt getting lost later, but then again, you could argue that that's because Egypt itself, as we've covered, has this sort of history of being a rebellious sort of self-governing state.
That's a comment for a bit later in the stream, but yes, it's an important point as to why Egypt and Syria break off. We'll get to Heraclius.
Just because we're on a religious context, should we mention the apocryphal quote by Julian upon his death?
Sure.
That allegedly because he's said to have copped a spear in either the belly or the chest, and his dying words to his physician, which was what was his name? I've just gone blank. He's from Pergamum. He was a Greek doctor from Pergamum, and his alleged last words were, "Vicisti Galilei, you have one Galilean."
Yes, we've
So
covered this. It's my favorite.
he
It's
took
my
his
favorite last
battle
word.
he took his battle to Christianity rather seriously, which is ironic given that Constantine, his blood relative, was the establisher of Christianity in the empire. So there's a strange little twist of history for those who weren't aware.
Absolutely. Now, we can't really afford to talk really that much about the decline in the West. We do have a podcast dedicated to that, which is Italy Between Empires on this channel. But suffice to say, during the reigns of Honorius and Majorian, we have the cascade effect of the various disintegration of Roman territories into basically barbarian fiefdoms. So we have the Visigoths establishing themselves in the area around Bordeaux and later in Spain. We have the Vandals establishing themselves in North Africa. We have the Franks obviously established themselves in the region of Austrasia, which will later become northern France. And then we have the Goths again after the kingdom of Odovacar is destroyed in the west, which ends the Roman Empire in 476. We have the kingdom of Theodoric the Great. In terms of what's happening on the Eastern Empire during this time, we have the long reign of Theodosius II, who replaces Arcadius. And this is where, again, you have the reinforcement of the Theodosian Wars. Zeno is going to be the emperor who presides over the formal loss of the West and first attempts to try and come to a new understanding in terms of the relationship between the new situation with the Ostrogoths and prior to him, the Odovacar, and what the relationship is going to be. And as we establish in Italy between empires, the relationship was going to be of nominal fealty, whilst maintaining many of the Roman institutions. Although this would, change over the course of hundreds of years and accelerate with the Lombard invasions. But again, that's much later on.
And I'd say we also see the collapse, the increasing collapse of classical Latin learning and literature, culture of letters all over the Mediterranean basin, but particularly in the West. In the East, you have a long history of Greek philosophy, which can of course persist and then is translated into the philosophy of the Arabs and what have you.
As you can see here, this roughly corresponds to the western half of the Empire of Alexander, i.e. the Hellenized area. So we have, Greek Anatolia, we have the Seleucids in Syria, with the Ptolemies in Egypt, we have the Antigonids in Macedonia. Of course, we have the various polis of Hellas. It's no surprise that Greek, as the lingua franca in the region already, and the language of culture, slowly seep in and begin to replace Latin as the language for everyday use, whilst the official Roman administration still uses Latin in many cases, including the ecclesiastical case. But there will also be the substitution for various Germanic languages and vernaculars, which will become the modern Romance languages, but much later on.
And we see the transferal of the sort of no longer is the Roman state the bearer of Latinity and Western Latin culture. It's now primarily the church.
Yes, the church is the continuation of the Roman Empire in the West. And again, the church still during this point has to be emphasized, is subordinate to the emperor. The emperor is the keystone of the religion, even though within the episcopacies themselves, the Pope maintains a prominent position. But of course, as a result of the loss of Italy, he is now under the rule of Theodoric the Great, and Theodoric the Great makes great pains to try and reconcile the two parties. Later on during the which of the various controversies was this, the Acacian Schism. So yes, there is going to be a new relationship born out of this severing, but as we know, it doesn't last very long. We have the reign of Anastasius, which is an effective reign in the sense that we have this renewed fortification of the Danubian provinces, and we have a long period of peace, nearly 30 years of peace under Anastasius, and we have a consolidation of the imperial treasury and a booming economy, whilst the West is completely, the Roman Empire in the West has ceased to exist. However, he brings a component of his reign, which is a controversial element, which is the fact that he's a monophysite, the fact that he has a different interpretation of the exact divine nature of Christ in opposition to the Nicene Creed. And this is is responsible for the Acacian schism between the Roman pontiff in the west and the emperor in the east. And this is resolved under Justinian's uncle Justin, who becomes emperor in 518 to 527, who of course is grooming Justinian, his nephew, to take power after him, because he's an incredibly well-read, talented, if not very effective as a soldier. I don't believe there was much in the way of martial experience for Justinian. Am I wrong?
No, I don't think so. I think most of his he relied on people like Belisarius for his generalship. Sure. The other thing, sorry, I'll just get this in quickly. Just about the exact controversy that you were talking about there with monophysitism. I believe the controversy was you had one group of people who believed, and this was the people, the likes of Eutychus, and they believed that in Christ there were two distinct essences, his human essence and his divine essence, and then and they remain somehow separate. And I believe he also denied the incarnation because of this. And then the monophysites, I believe, they thought that the two essences had somehow come together to birth a new separate essence, and so that is the heart of that controversy at the time about the exact nature of Christ. Again, I've talked about Boethius a lot. He actually wrote the Contra Eutychian, the against Eutychus, which refutes this in favor of the Orthodox or Catholic position. So I check that out if you want to learn more.
Marcus?
I was just going to say that another thing to consider about Justinian is he was actually when Justin rose to the throne, he was captain of, I think, the Excubitores, the imperial bodyguard, and when he became emperor, Justinian took a place in the guard himself. But one of the units that he was there were several units of the Excubitores, for those who are wondering, and some of them were actual combat, what the Greeks called taxias, which are regiments. Many of them are combat regiments, and some of them were ceremonial. And the one that Justinian was in was a strictly ceremonial unit. And Justinian himself proved to be not necessarily a warrior emperor, in that, yes, he did conduct a lot of wars as foreign policy, but he almost always stayed in Constantinople. He was quite fortunate to live in a generation of quite capable generals, typified by Belisarius, but also you have Mundus, you have Narses, you have John the Cappadocian, who fight these campaigns for him. But Justinian himself he's not a sort of blood and guts soldier warrior in the same way that, say, Caesar was, or Gallienus, or Aurelian, or Constantine.
Yes,
I always sorry, I just wondered, Narses, was he a Greek? Because the name to me sounds distinctly sort of Sassanian or Persian, but I'm not sure. And maybe his family had some descent.
I believe his background's actually somewhat ambiguous. He claims to be Greek, but like you say, the name doesn't etymologically sound particularly Hellenic, but don't know. I haven't done my research.
Yes, so obviously we've covered the Renovatio Imperii various times on this channel, and again I'll mention the fact that we have this episode, Italy Between Empires, which goes into detail, especially regarding the Italian situation. But before that happens, he comes to power in 527, and very quickly afterwards he commissions Tribonius to create the uniform Roman law, known now as the Corpus Juris Civilis. And this is, one of the largest undertakings in terms of this codification of Roman law that we've ever seen sort of in human history. Again, we've mentioned various allusions to it under Diocletian, but from 529 to 534, we have this uniform codification of Roman law, which is going to be used as the basis for most of continental law. Even up until this day, it has served as the basis of most continental law, and even ecclesiastical law at the same time. So the origin of canon law in many respects is founded in the Corpus Juris Civilis. Before we get to the Nika riots in 532, which again are quite a turning point, and you've made, Marcus, the argument before that the Renovatio Imperii was in many ways a response to, or because of the Nika riots. But coming to his religious policies, he, as essentially his his uncle's lieutenant, is put on the issue of ending the schism, the Echesian schism between the various Monophysite factions. In terms of Columba, you mentioned earlier on the stream the particular issue with Egypt and Syria. Monophysites were very prominent in Egypt and Syria, whereas Orthodox, as we now know today, were very prominent in Anatolia and in Greece. So the emperor was put in this almost impossible position of having, originally got the Pope back on side, of trying to pacify the various bishops of Egypt. And to this extent, he actually reverses his policy later in his reign. And he tries to form a compromise to assuage the Monophysites, even forcing the Pope Viglus to confirm this at a compromise, the Fifth Ecumenical Council. So, as you can see, there are many issues with the church, and one can argue actually that it's not resolved until you have the definitive loss of these provinces during the 630s and the 640s. But in terms of his other actions regarding the church, we do see this revival of the persecution of non-Orthodox and indeed pagans, as we saw under Constantius and we saw under Theodosius. And this again is the main source in this is John of Ephesus. I believe it's during this time that the final Neoplatonic Academy in Athens in the year 529, so just after it takes power, is finally closed down.
Yep.
And in terms of the economy, Pharaoh will get very frustrated if I don't mention this. We also have the importation of silk, but also we have the creation of a local silk trade by the Byzantines being able to cultivate the use of silk during this point, which again acts as a major boon for the Eastern economy during this period. So,
ironically brought to the city by Nestorian monks as well.
One other point I would make is you mentioned the huge codification of laws which is going on at this time. But I would say it's even more than that, right? Because I mean, in the West, as we've mentioned, much of the old administration, it's gone, and with it, this Latin culture, the literary culture, the culture of sort of artistic patronage has taken a sort of a real hit in a way, and it resurges later. I mean, you have people like Boethius preserving it, but then obviously, when you have people like Petrarch and the Renaissance comes along, it blows up again. But in the East, of course, I mean, it's the Basileia ton Romaeon for until the 1400s, and so they have this idea of themselves as Romans, and also they have this attachment to the classical, say, but also the economy of the East stays relatively stable, and you still have these complex systems of patronage. And so you see at the same time people like, I think, Zosimon or all these Byzantine scholars who are collecting sort of fragments of older philosophers and historians, and a lot of this is sort of interwoven with the legal writings, talking about precedents, and they quote older people, and a remarkable amount of historical value has been gotten out of these things in terms of finding fragments of things that otherwise wouldn't have existed. So there was some very important things going on in terms of preservation, which of course, I mean, it laid the foundation for what happened in the Muslim world later after the heresies of Nestorianism and what have you had borne their full fruit,
Yes, and I think that's you mentioned a very important point. Again, it's the preservation of these laws, but it's also for historians, the Corpus Juris Civilis just gives us a representation of what was important to the Romans back then, and how everyday life functioned. What was the relationship between the court system and the people? So no, it is an invaluable resource. But I think in terms of getting to chronology, that brings us to the Nicorites. And if you don't mind me saying, Marcus, you're probably one of the best qualified to talk on this subject. So do you want to take us through the Nicorites?
You flattered me, thank you. Well, the Nicorites are in some respect a response to, there's a few things at play here. A large portion of the East Roman aristocracy, the aristocracy that resides primarily in Constantinople, look down upon this dynasty. They consider John, not John, Justin, something of a ruffian. He is considered a provincial lout, oafish. Writers such as Procopius use quite strong language to describe their sentiments towards him. There's actually a quote, but I thought I'd written it down in my notes and I didn't, so I apologize. But it describes Justin essentially being as those things that I mentioned, and that the heavy lifting of state is done by a young Justinian as a member of this palatial excubitores, this sort of this celebratory guard. But then when Justinian ascends to become emperor, he's married to Theodora, and I think we touched on Theodora on a previous stream, but most of us here know that Theodora has a colourful past, shall we say, and that
Yes, yes, indeed.
whilst he was heir in waiting, he had his uncle Justin change the law so that he was actually able to marry Theodora, because under the laws of the time, he was unable to marry her due to her low status,
Yeah.
and being a consul, which was a much diminished role vis-a-vis what a consul was in, say, the Republican Roman period.
Still prestigious, though, right?
It was still highly prestigious and still had power in the city insofar that it was the consul in Constantinople that had the role of, was it the Aediles in Rome who held games? I can't remember. But the
Yes, it
consul
was
in
Aediles.
Constantinople. Okay, so the consul in Rome, in Constantinople, does that in the east, in the eastern system.
Yes, because they're still having they have huge horse races in a hippodrome, right? I mean
Correct,
the chariot racing culture still exists.
Well, gladiatorial combat is outlawed, I think, during Theodosius's reign or just before. But they still have the hippodrome, they still have races, and they still have sort of other performances and things sort of pertaining to triumphs and that sort of stuff. I mean, Belisarius, for instance, has a triumph after the culmination of the Vandalic War. So Justinian has this very he has this reputation of being very intelligent, very erudite, well-read, able, and he does the heavy lifting for his uncle. His uncle dies, becomes emperor. And on one hand, Justinian is he's this sort of savant. He's this visionary. He's highly ambitious. His building program almost starts at the onset of his reign. He sets about to improve and to build in Constantinople and the major cities around the empire. And to do that, he has to raise taxes, and his tax policies, almost for the duration of his life, are considered unpopular. And between this and the disregard for his status and the view of which people, well illustrated by Procopius, have of Theodora, culminate in this event called the Nika riots. And essentially, Justinian and Theodora attend the hippodrome as they always did, except on this occasion, that they come there, the crowd are even more rowdy. Actually, sorry, there's a start point before this. There's two people who are apprehended for some mischief in the city. One happens to be a member of the Greens, and one is a Blue. For those who don't know, they were the colours of the Hippodrome teams, the Greens and Blues being the two large teams of the Hippodrome teams. And the execution of these two criminals is botched, and they actually escape the execution, and they take refuge, I believe it's in the Hagia Sophia, or one of the big churches in the city. And then the following day, Justinian and Theodora go to the hippodrome. The crowd is already quite hostile towards him. He ignores it initially because Justinian and Theodora do have quite, even though they're considered approachable, they're quite aloof to the populace broadly. And the crowd gathers this inertia, and they jeer him, and this vocal rebuke of Justinian becomes louder and louder until such time they start chanting in the crowd, Nika, 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 which in Greek means victory. And then he poses to the crowd what they want, and very strangely they ask for the sacking of Tribonian and John the Cappadocian, which for peasants, more or less, that's kind of a strange request. I mean, these are just sort of in what we call in Rome the head count, just the urbanites. It's a strange request for the peasants, and then he says he'll do it, and it's not enough. And eventually they sort of call for him to resign, and then they prop up a blood relative of Anastasius, which is it Hypatius, I think. And more or less he gets wind that this is not just a popular uprising. Certainly there's popular sentiments there, but this is being fed to some degree by the aristocracy, which is chafing under Justinian. And then Justinian withdraws into the palace. He's more or less set on leaving the city and either setting up a regime elsewhere or just abdicating. And then there's this legendary intervention by Theodora, who
Yeah.
I don't have the whole quote on me, sadly, but she more or less states that there's an old custom that this is her talking just to Justinian. She says, there's this old custom that I adhere to, that purple and the imperial robes make a fine death shroud. Basically, more or less saying, Justinian, we're in this for keeps. We either fight our way out of this, or we die as emperor and empress. And Justinian is redoubled by this. He sort of spruiks back up, and he gains his nerve again. So it so happens that in the palace at this time, he has Belisarius and Mundus at his disposal, with imperial bodyguard, the Excubitores, what you might call the predecessor to the Numeroi, which is sort of the city soldiers that garrison the walls of the city, and Mundus has some mercenaries at his disposal. So the two generals are dispatched to opposite ends of the hippodrome. Narses, who at this point is not a general, he's only an administrator at this point of his career, is dispatched to the Blues to bribe leaders of the Blues to thin out the crowd, which they do successfully.
And just because I'm no expert on this as well, at this point
Sure.
the crowd has sort of occupied the hippodrome, right?
And they've set fire to large portions of the city. For instance, the baths of Zephyzithus are almost destroyed at this point. Like the
But I
mean,
mean,
the Hagia Sophia is destroyed as well, the original one.
And exactly, yeah, large portions of the city, and certainly of the city centre, are either ransacked or burning or burnt down. It's an absolute catastrophe at this point by the time Justinian's being talked back into it by Theodora. It turns into essentially probably the example of the greatest individual instance of civil uprising in history. And so they go back into the hippodrome. Narses weakens the Blues by bribing some of their leaders. And what follows when the imperial troops are deployed against the uprising is nothing short of a massacre. Anywhere in the order of 40 to 50,000 citizens of the city are killed in an afternoon. It is a catastrophe. It is running of blood, which probably most people can't get their heads around. It is a monumental event of the empire and of Justinian's rule.
it's some day of work, huh?
Yes. And the thing is, it is so comprehensive that even though there is chafing discontent for the vast majority of Justinian's rule, even at the zenith of his achievements in Africa and Italy, no one dares to rise against him again. This Nika riot and its consequences is seared into the mind of at least two generations of Byzantine citizens, of Roman citizens here. It's that big of a deal. It's that momentous.
Thank you very much for that, Marcus. I'm afraid I'm going to have to rush through the Renovatio Imperii for two reasons. First of all, we have very little time, but also because we have covered it quite extensively.
Yeah, I was going to say we've discussed it. Yeah,
we more or less have. Yeah.
So yes, I'll, for the benefit of the audience who may not have seen that, I'll give a very brief introduction, which is, in the aftermath of the Nika riots, Belisarius is dispatched and he conquers the Vandalic kingdom of North Africa. Subsequently, we have the internal strife caused by the succession war within the kingdom of the Ostrogoths, and that is used as a pretext by Justinian to retake the kingdom. And there's a very brief conquest, relatively 535 to 540, which consolidates Italy under Byzantine rule. Then you have and of course you have Liberius also taking up Hispania as well, as you can see in the map. However, in the meantime, there is also the plague of Justinian, which is one of the most devastating plagues. Probably equivalent to the bubonic plague in the middle of the medieval era.
Yeah, they reckon about a third of the population of the empire or something.
Yes,
horrific.
Between about 20% and a third. Huge amount of the population dies. You have a complete devastation of the Italian cities in particular as a result of the combined efforts of the plague and the war. And of course, then we have the invasion of the Lombards, which after the reign of Justinian, causes the dismemberment of much of Italy, even though you have the administrations of the exarchs of Ravenna, and you have the administrations in southern Italy, Sicily, and Sardinia and Corsica. In terms of, again, the immediate aftermath of the Nika riots, another effect, of course, are the massive building projects under Justinian. The best example of this, of course, being the new church of Hagia Sophia, which is the it still exists in Istanbul today as a museum, even though I believe they tried to change it back to a mosque as it was under
Yes,
the
it's part
Ottoman
of
Empire.
Erdogan's,
Ongoing controversy.
nonsense. Yes,
and it was, I believe, until the 17th century, the largest church in the world at that point. So a monumental piece of architecture.
one of the largest buildings, full stop. Yeah,
and incredibly influential, not just for all subsequent, Roman architecture, and include Western architecture as well, but also Islamic architecture. And this gets us into, and again, he dies 565, very old man, and the empire is basically worn out. Would you like to make any sort of closing remark, Marcus, regarding the rule of Justinian?
Yeah, there's a really fitting quote here from Agathias, because I was actually going to mention a quote from John Malalas, but I think I did that in the other stream about the emperor's moralistic decrees, so I won't quote myself again. But this quote by Agathias is a summary essentially from the end of his life, and the quote goes, "At an earlier date, the emperor had become almost the first of the rulers of Constantinople to be emperor of the Romans in fact as well as in name. He had accomplished those and similar feats when he was in the full vigor of youth. But now, in his declining years, when old age was upon him, he seemed to have wearied of the vigorous policies, and to prefer to play off his enemies against one another, and, if necessary, to coax them away with material gifts." So there's quite a profound change in his disposition, and you might say, even though he contracted plague and got over it, he never really recovered from the failed campaigns in Italy, and really losing Theodora, even though he lived to the ripe old age of 83, did Justinian, there's certain hits to his character he doesn't recover from.
Sorry, he was also 20 years older than Theodora as well.
Yes,
so.
yes. You might say that the Justinian that took over from his uncle is very much not the Justinian who dies an old man and alone in the palace.
did he not become sort of more paranoid as time went on? I mean, with Belisarius and the generals being recalled and what have you. Yeah, but I mean, I think this is just very illustrative of, I mean, it's a cliche at this point, right? But power doesn't make you happy. It just corrupts,
Probably the most famous source on this is, of course, the Secret History by Procopius,
yes,
which, of course, has a very dark portrayal of Justinian and Theodora, needless
especially to say. Theodora. Yeah.
So we're getting to the final phase, which is the formal creation of the Basileia Romaion, which is getting to the reign of Heraclius. But of course, we can't just jump into the reign of Heraclius because there's a lot that happens. As you can see on this map, the loss of much of the possessions in Italy due to the Lombard invasions takes place mostly during the reign of Justinian's nephew, Justin II. However, the Emperor Maurice is the interesting character to really focus on, because Maurice is a very effective emperor. At the beginning of his reign, you have a series of setbacks we see the arrivals of the Avars and the southern Slavs. And for about 9 years, they are pushing into to Thrace and modern-day Serbia and the Balkans, as you can see. Much later on, this is going to be the effect. And he is able, from 591 till 602, to successfully campaign and refortify and establish a strong frontier in the north. And he's also the author of the Strategikon, which was one of the most famous Byzantine military handbooks. However, because he was, perpetually on campaign, you're always faced with the perennial issue of mutinous soldiers, if you're not being paid. And one of these mutinous soldiers, by the name of Phocas, leads a mutiny in 602 and murders the Emperor Maurice in 602. Just to give a bit of perspective, why the emperor was able to prosecute such an aggressive campaign in the Balkans at this time was because he had achieved a peace with the new emperor of the Sassanian Empire, Khosrow II, in 591. And Khosrow II basically used the usurpation of Maurice by Phocas as a pretext to attack, claiming also that he had the son of Theodosius, Maurice, who had ostensibly again failed to be killed by Phocas, had retreated to his court and appealed to the emperor to fight for his claim. But again, that was we could pretty much establish that was entirely false. He was a false pretender. But the casus belli was justified by the fact that he had a formal alliance with Maurice and not with Phocas. And so he begins the very much the climactic showdown between the Sassanian Empire and the Byzantine Empire. So before we get into talking about Heraclius, there is this quote from Edward Gibbon. Everything regarding Edward Gibbon and the Byzantine Empire and Roman Empire, Eastern Roman Empire, you have to take with a pinch of salt, because he's very unflattering regarding it. And I think most of the modern opinion, or the disparaging opinion, comes from that, even though there has been substantive revision in the last sort of 60 years or so. Nevertheless, it's quite an interesting quote. Of the characters conspicuous in history, that of Heraclius is one of the most extraordinary and inconsistent. In the first and last years of a long reign, the emperor appears to be a slave of sloth, of pleasure, of superstition, the careless and impotent spectator of the public calamities. But the languid mists of the morning and evening are separated by the brightness of the meridian sun. The Arcadius of the palace arose, the Caesar of the camp, and the honour of Rome and Heraclius was gloriously retrieved by the exploits and trophies of 6 adventurous campaigns. Since the days of Scipio and Hannibal, no bolder enterprise has been attempted, that in which Heraclius achieved the deliverance of the empire. When he's referring to the various licentious elements, I believe this primarily comes from Heraclius marrying his niece Martina, which was considered incestuous at the time and was widely disparaged. And Heraclius's longtime ally, the patriarch Sergius, offered on many occasions to divorce Martina from the emperor. Nevertheless, he refused, and she would later become embroiled in the various, Heracliid civil wars that would fall on the empire after his death. But nevertheless, he begins his career as the son of the exarch of Africa, which had been recently reconquered during the Renovatio Imperii of Justinian. And it's in that position that he launches a naval campaign to depose the usurper Phocas, who is doing very poorly against the Sassanians in the war. And he achieves this in 610, is installed as emperor. However, he's not in a position where he's able to quickly reverse all of the military disasters incurred by his predecessor. So very quickly, the Persians overrun Syria for the first time, it needs to be mentioned. The border had obviously fluctuated. Armenia had been the main battleground because it was an independent state for most of its history, and it would switch its alliances between the Romans and the Sassanians.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a classical buffer state,
yes.
Right? Yeah.
And the main sort of territory which would switch hands would be Upper Mesopotamia, just across from the Euphrates River. However, this was the first sort of major expansion of the Persian Empire, the first time they sort of got this far since the Achaemenids, just to put this in perspective in terms of like what a breach this was. And the worst thing is, this just continued. Heraclius tried to launch a counterattack, to counter this threat in Syria, and that fails between 611 and 613. I mentioned the fact that Maurice had been able to hold on to the Danubian frontier. Well, the Danubian frontier then breaks, and the South Slavs and the Avars attack Constantinople and besiege it for the first time. The Persians, at the same time, had just taken over Jerusalem and Palestine, and they famously captured the True Cross. And worse than that, by 1615, they have got all the way to Chalcedon, which, in Byzantine law, Chalcedon is the city of the blind, the city established opposite Byzantium. So the Persians are actually in a position where they could potentially take the entire empire. And this is where, again, you have one of those monumentous conversations in history between Patriarch Sergius and Heraclius. Heraclius at this point is prepared to flee the capital, a la Justinian, and relocate the recovery of the empire from Carthage. But it is Sergius in particular who commits him with the full support of the church, because of course the church has a vested interest in regaining all of these territories lost to the Zoroastrian Persian Empire. Commits all the resources of the church and the empire to this war, including, melting down of various church treasures in Constantinople, devaluing the currency even more, and basically putting on a total war footing to deal with the Sassanian threat, which could potentially have ended the empire. And one of the first successes, I believe, is the the counterattack. But before then, there is even more defeat. Whilst Heraclius is consolidating his army and resources after 615, in 618, I believe, Khosrau takes over Egypt as well for the first time, severing all of these provinces. And it isn't until 622 that Heraclius is able to launch his first major counteroffensive against the Persians, which is successful. And rather than going to recover the provinces of Syria and of Egypt, he decides to focus on the Caucasus and Armenia so he can attack Mesopotamia and the capital of Ctesiphon. And so from 622 until 627, the emperor is campaigning aggressively in these areas, trying to take the Persians, away from the capital. Nevertheless, during this, in 626, the Avars, the Slavs, and the Persians all besiege Constantinople. I believe this is the first siege of Constantinople, proper siege. And the city is under the leadership of Patriarch Sergius. And because of its, again, impregnable position, it is able to hold off against the Persian general Sharbarash, against all of these threats, basically surrounding the city. And it is after this that the Byzantine Empire really begins to build momentum against the Persians. In terms of the loyalty of the generals, Sharbarash actually defects and becomes neutral, no longer deciding to side with Khosrau after this. And in 627, Heraclius is able to defeat the Persians at the Battle of Nineveh, which was the old capital of the Assyrian Empire, just in the north of Mesopotamia. And this results in the coup against Khosrau, who, again, is incredibly unpopular at this point for being at war for nearly 30 years. And now Heraclius is going to march on the capital of Ctesiphon. After all of the progress that's been made by the Persians, all of it had seemingly been reversed in 6 years under the forces of Heraclius. So he is deposed and murdered, and his son, Kavad II, takes over and creates a formal peace with the emperor. And the effect of this peace, as alluded to in terms of the Scipio-esque struggle against Hannibal, in terms of how close the empire came to its destruction, Kavad II establishes the status quo ante bellum. So all of the provinces which have been taken from the Eastern Roman Empire during the war, a la Egypt and Syria and parts of Anatolia, are ceded back to them. And the True Cross prominently is ceded back to them, which is why you have this allegory here, which never happened, of course, because Khosrau was usurped and never gave peace, of the emperor basically falling over and subjugating himself to the might of Heraclius. And in terms of the effect on Heraclius, Heraclius uses this opportunity to declare himself King of Kings, and also he takes the title of Basileus, which was the title vaguely synonymous to king under the Hellenic period. So Antiochus III, for example, the emperor of the Seleucid Empire, was known as the Megas Basileus, the Great King, among other things. And he uses this opportunity as well, because I mentioned that Syria and Egypt were Monophysite predominantly, to try and bring a formal reconciliation for the church. And he does this by creating a new church doctrine known as monothelitism, or I pronounce it wrong. It's a bit difficult to pronounce. And this is, again, a compromise between the Chalcedonians and the Monophysites. Nevertheless, it irritates both parties, and even the huge amount of goodwill incurred by him unifying the empire after this gargantuan struggle isn't enough to create this compromise religion. And so the issue is left virtually unresolved until the actual loss of these territories with Monophysite populations actually ensures the victory of orthodoxy in this era. And again,
no, I was just gonna say because Heraclius is the same guy. We talked about this before we started the stream. He changes the official language of the administration to Greek as well.
Yes, this happens very early on. The official changing of the language to Greek happens in 610. And I believe this is, again, just an official recognition of what had happened, which is the fact that the center of the Roman world had moved east into this Hellenized area, the principal Hellenized area.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
that,
look at Italy at this point, right?
yes, exactly.
And this is again, this is the, yeah, this is kind of Italy where any sort of eloquent Latin writers or Latin philosophers, people like Boethius, have literally been ground down or executed, you know, and so it's solely the preserve of the church at this point. But even then, much of that is bound up in, much of the Latin writing is bound up in monasteries and what have you, and there's not a great the same kind of input in public life that Greek still has in the East.
Exactly. And this is where we really have the creation of, again, for lack of a better word, what is recognizably a Byzantine Empire as a historiographical concept. This Greek-speaking Oriental, again, adopting even the Greek style of king, eschewing the traditional rank of Augustus, even though, again, there would be no sort of de jure abolition of these titles, but more the de facto acceptance of this Greek influence. All of which points to what we've underlined in the stream, which is the fundamental transformation of the Roman Empire. However, in terms of like the final transformation, which is, the territorial transformation, I mentioned that there is this great victory in 627, and we have the final victory against Khosrow by Heraclius. However, it's very short-lived, and this is one of the most sort of tragic elements of his reign, that whilst you have this struggle which is concluded finally after 30 years of war, the Rashidun Caliphate have been consolidating its rule over Arabia at this point.
Because the Sassanians and the Romans have been battling for 30 years, right?
Exactly. And in 629, just after the victory, you have the first Rashidun raid on Syria, and this is pushed back rather convincingly. And as a result, Heraclius doesn't believe there's any serious threat, because the Arabs, the Romans had a buffer state, the Ghassanids, which were a tribe of Arabs in the just near Petra. And so they basically believed their borders were secure. The Ghassanids and the Romans had defeated the Rashidun Caliphate, and so there was no threat. And again, even the Strategicon of Maurice had virtually no mention, very very short iteration of the Arabs as any sort of fighting power. So it was a completely alien power that the Romans were encountering, and of course not just the Romans, the Sassanians,
both of which are absolutely economically crippled at this point.
Yes,
right?
Exactly. Yadzagerd III becomes King of Kings of the Sassanian Empire in 632, which consolidates the massive instability caused by the usurpation of Khosrow, and he has near 20-year reign. Nevertheless, the entire empire is virtually conquered by 650. And when it comes to the Byzantine Empire, of course, now you have the decisive defeat of the Byzantine forces at the Battle of Yarmouk by the most famous of the Rashidun generals, Khalid al-Walid. And this drives most of the Byzantine forces out of the region of Palestine, back to Damascus, back to Antioch, and into Egypt. And in 641, Egypt falls just at the moment where Heraclius finally dies. Egypt is lost. So as you can see from this map, this territory where you have the Armenian highlands, correspondingly the boundary of the eastern boundary of Asia Minor, the loss of Syria, the loss of Egypt, you see the Slavic Avar raids into the Balkans, even raiding as far south as southern Greece, as you can see, the Lombard invasions into Italy. And this area in Africa is not going to be part of the empire for long. It's going to be lost over the course of the next 100 years. And as you can see, Spain has also been lost. So what we see is
lost to the Umayyad Caliphate, right? Or is it still the Rashidun?
The Umayyads replaced the Rashidun Caliphate, yeah. So what you can see here from the map is, again, the territorial transformation of the empire. And again, one of the effects, as I mentioned, of the Monophysites being cut off is that the empire becomes more consolidated in its Orthodox Nicene Christian identity. And
in response, if you will.
Yeah.
Because I'm not an expert on this at all, but I've heard some people toss around these ideas that Islam or Mohammedism, as I think we should all call it, it arose out of obviously this sort of pagan and Abrahamic ferment in Arabia. But there are people who explicitly try and link it with Nestorianism, and which you've said were very popular in Syria and Egypt and these sorts of heresies.
And
do you
Manichaeanism as well. I think Manichaeanism was considered during this time to be the main contender for Christianity more than Islam.
Yeah, definitely. There was a big there was a point where it looked like it could go either way, I suppose. But my point would be, do you think that these heresies had a role here in terms of easing the way for Islam to come in and to conquer these areas in the Levant and Egypt in particular? Because obviously we know that there's the infrastructure things of like Egypt wants to be independent, etc. But do you think there were ideological factors at play here? Because I just don't know.
I'm not well versed in this to be able to claim whether there was strict ideological factions. I mean, in terms of like the future of this channel, we will hopefully at some point, many years down the line,
yes, when we're both old and grey, yes,
be focusing on the history of Persia and the Near East in general, as a counterbalance to all this focus on Europe and the Catholic world and the Orthodox world. But in terms of actually trying to talk about the theological character of Islam, I really want to leave that to another stream. I think it's just suffice to say.
Yeah, we'll just slap on another 5 hours.
Yes, suffice to say that the empire was economically, militarily weakened, and that I don't see any possibility of the Rashidun Caliphate making such a massive breakthrough into the world and expanding as quickly and as rapidly as they did, had it not been for this titanic struggle between the Sassanian and Eastern Roman empires, which, as we see, is, to me, it's almost reminiscent of the Punic Wars. Had there been a third player that rushed in at the end and consolidated all the gains, which of course did not happen during the Punic Wars.
I had one last question to ask Marcus. When it comes to the Muslim conquests here, were there any? Because I know there were a lot of horsemen, but were there any particular sort of technological or strategic tactical advantages that the Muslims employed? Like were there any was there a superiority there, or was it just the fact that the other states were so weakened, or were the Muslims doing something really well?
I actually just want to, I'll answer your question first, but I do want to touch on Heraclius afterwards, but I know we're pressed for time. But to answer your question in the immediate context, what we have is, you and AM have both touched on the exhaustion of the Roman state and the Persian state, and I think we can very accurately use the term total war in this context. 30 years, astronomical casualties on both sides, economic ruin in some of the richest portions of both empires, the siege of Constantinople itself, and then Heraclius's mighty counterattack through the Armenian highlands and into Anatolia, into the Mesopotamia, and eventually with the capture and sack of Ctesiphon, absolutely gutted both empires in terms of manpower, in terms of finance, in terms of agricultural productivity. And I think most of us in our field, or of those of us who share our worldview, have often mused that had Heraclius almost dropped dead when he arrived back in Constantinople, he would have been considered amongst the greatest of Roman emperors for his achievements. It just so happens that he suffered from that curse of not living quite long enough and not quite dying soon enough. He lived long enough to see the unraveling of his great achievements, but but not long enough to be able to counter. Because as AM said, it's with the capture of Egypt. Actually, at that exact point in time, Heraclius had just assembled an army in Constantinople when he dies,
Well,
which
I
was
think
prepared for the counterattack in Egypt.
I think again it comes back to what we said on our first stream. Again, every single time you see a corrective shift, right? The succeeding disaster is even worse, you know?
But to
You just
answer your
can't
question,
win.
but to answer your question specifically about the Arabs, because I don't want to forget that, because you made a point of asking,
Sure, yeah.
is what you see is the Arabs thriving in a climate which they're absolutely used to. The Romans and the Persians, and more the Persians and the Romans, aren't exactly unacclimatized to desert warfare. They're not. I mean, you got to think a third of the Roman world runs along the Syrian and Egyptian deserts, African deserts. Like the Romans know what a desert is, and the Persians. I mean, there are parts of Persia that are quite lush and almost Mediterranean climate, and there are parts of Persia which are almost desertified. So they're not entirely foreign to it either. But the Arabs are literally born of the desert. Them fighting on the outer perimeters of Syria and of Judea, Palestine, in the southern portions of Mesopotamia, they're in the element. And there's actually an instance where I think Khalid ibn al-Walid crosses over from Mesopotamia after, I think it's the Battle of Qasadiya. He actually crossed the desert to reinforce the Arab forces operating in Syria, Palestine. I think it's in the lead up to Yarmouk.
And
And
there are two. Sorry, I was just
no,
going to say. I suppose also they have a sort of deep experience with sort of, I guess, more primitive tribal warfare and disagreements. But they've also I mean the general who you guys have mentioned. I mean, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce it. I'll just embarrass myself. But they were all these generals were all related to Muhammad in some way or other, right? And so I feel like there's there are tools available to the Muslims which allow them to have legitimate, at least in somewhat legitimate and stable leadership that in the Byzantine Empire seems to have fallen apart, at least somewhat. You know, way more backstabbing.
well,
But I'm
yeah. Well, I mean, I can touch on that, but just on the technological question, just briefly, or the methodology question. The Arabs, when they cross from Mesopotamia to reinforce Syria, they have their cattle drink inordinate amount of water to fill their humps, and they gradually kill these camels on the march through the desert because they don't want to be detected by the Persian or Roman scouts. So they march literally straight, almost following the reverse course of Marcus Crassus, actually, just south of Carrhae. But they do this to sort of disguise their movement from the Romans and the Persians. And as they're marching through the desert, they actually, in increments, at certain points of time, kill these camels to drink their water, to open up their humps and to drink their water.
yeah,
And
I've seen someone do that.
Yeah, and then because the Arabs were quite good with astronomy, they guided themselves at night. They used to night march so they could use the stars and essentially not get lost. Because I mean, one thing to consider is it's one thing if you're following the Danube or you're following the Tiber or you're following the Po or the Rhone, you have features. You've got the Alps, you've got hills, you've got this, you've got that. I mean, in the desert, aside from dunes and plains,
Yeah, it's like
there's no
sailing.
features.
Many
So
have compared it
exactly.
to sailing. Yeah.
And of course, the desert, especially like the Syrian desert, the Arabian desert, is hot as all buggery. Marching in the day is suicidal, and Crassus found out the hard way, as have other armies in the past. So the Arabs would actually be quite docile in the day and then march at night, and they'd march using the stars. So they actually crossed from Mesopotamia with the reinforcements into Syria, totally undetected, with minimal attrition losses, and their forces intact and well rested. And this actually surprised the Romans, who've sent all these reinforcements to prepare for the Battle of Yarmouk and this sort of decisive battle with Khalid and his generals, his Arab generals in Syria. And the Romans are quite astonished that the Muslims, the Arabs, have arrayed this force that neither the Persians nor the Romans detected. And it's
Well, I
through those
suppose
methods of fighting that they did that.
I suppose if you look at Bedouin tribes today, I mean, they still use the stars to find to move from
Yeah.
watering hole.
It's
Yeah.
it's foolproof, it's absolutely foolproof. And the second thing is that the way that the early Rashidun Caliphate, I don't know the nuts and bolts of this, so I don't want to go speaking too far out of turn. But I mean, they were very galvanized by this sort of zealous adoption of Islam, and they felt quite bound by it.
There is one God, and Muhammad is his prophet.
Exactly. And the second thing is the way in which the tribes were incorporated, particularly after the Ridda Wars, the sort of the Islamic Wars of Unification. Because I mean, a lot of people probably watching this might know, but for those who have less understanding of this subject, Arabia, both prior to the arrival of Islam and the revelations of Muhammad in their religious context, and before the conclusion of the Ridda Wars, I mean, large parts of Arabia were atheistic. Parts adhered to, you guys mentioned Manichaeism, parts were Nestorian, parts were, in fact, Orthodox, parts were Jewish. It was not by any means uniform. It was very, very diverse. And so with the conclusion of the Ridda Wars and sort of the gradual adoption of Islam, you have this uniformity that occurs in Arabia, and this consolidation of strength in the caliphate. And secondly, the tribes who come to Islam and come to Muhammad and to Abu Bakr and his successors are all given roles of command. And you have your tribe and you command your body troops, and you two tribes fight under Khalid and you two fight under Abu Bakr, and there's a lot of responsibility and delegation. And so rather than having this culture of competition, which was quite prevalent inside the Roman and the Persian command structures,
instead they turn
actually
that outwards. Yeah,
exactly right. And that's their strength. And it just so happens that this occurs in a providential period of history for them, where these two titanic superpowers on their border are absolutely depleted. This would be the equivalent of, say, a resurgent Japan coming to the fore after the Soviet Union and the Americans had just nuclear salvoed each other. That would be
and I would say and I would say, looking at this, and looking at this history, this early history, this formative history, it should come as no surprise to any intelligent Christian why there is perhaps a very bellicose strain that runs throughout much of the Islamic world. It's because it was built on the momentum.
It was
of
born. It was brutally born.
conquest.
It was born on the scimitar. And just quickly, because I'm sure AM's anxious to move on, but we're talking about the uniformity, because we've touched, well, especially you two have touched a lot on the Monophysite question and these sort of breakaway sects. Is that with the Sassanid incursions, a lot of the cities which they swept across in that initial campaign, where they sort of press into Syria and then later into Egypt, a lot of cities opened their gates to the Persians, because they saw them essentially as liberators, because they considered the Romans were acting in a tyrannical fashion. I mean, quite famously, it was the slightly repatriated Jewish population in Jerusalem that flung the gates open up to the Persian forces. And so they largely
Well, I
assisted.
think there might have been some other motivations there, but that's another debate.
Exactly. But what I'm saying is that there was a lot of you might say, if we're to use a modern term, collaboration with the enemy. And this actually rears its head only a couple decades later, because when the Arabs come, a lot of these Near East populations certainly initially prefer Dimitude over the tyranny of Constantinople. Although they would lose their identity in the next 1,000 years, initially Dimitude was considered favorable.
Yep. Right. I have to end it there. Thank you very much for those comments, Marcus. A wonderful little conclusion to this discussion. Now we've reached the end of talking about the transformation. Get to super chats if that's all right. So $10 from Hunger. Great stream as always, AM. My family are Lebanese Eastern Orthodox, and so we're loyal to the empire even after it was conquered by the Ottomans. Amazing history that still carries over today. Interesting. Fascinating.
Very wholesome, sir. Thank you.
Sam Peter, for $5 Canadian, said, a blessing with the tithe. May you three be as wealthy as Didius Julianus, as robust as Aulus Vitellius, and as virtuous as Valerius Marianus.
Hopefully I don't end up like any of them. Goodness.
What happened to Marianus?
I don't know, but it probably wasn't good.
I know what happened to Didius.
Majorian was killed in the assassination. But to be honest with you, I mean, not to get all AA on everyone, but Majorian took the heroic path, so none should eschew it.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So, yes, of course he did. Sorry, brain. Judge Caligula Bushman for €5 has said, Tom Holland's book on Islam has an interesting theory about the origins of Islam and their conquests. Anyone familiar with it?
Really I've not read it, I'm afraid. The only book I read by Tom Holland was the only one I read was Rubicon by Tom Holland, which was not bad, by the way.
Sword in the Sand and Millennium very much cover this period and its aftermath very well, and I would recommend anybody to read it. Someone else in the chat says recommends it too, and yes, it very much is worth.
Yeah, Tom Holland's got a pretty good head on his shoulders. There's not that much pause in his works. They're very accessible too. They're a good starting point. Many of them.
He's one of the few normie academics actually following on Twitter, for instance.
Yeah, I follow him too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So I just get to what's going to happen after this. The series is going to be put on hiatus for another 3 weeks. And in a week, we are going to come back and we are going to focus on Charlemagne. So we'll get to the decline, resurgence of Byzantium during the middle period at a later point. But Byzantium is going to be put on hold for now. Now we get to the end. You two fine chaps, anything to shill?
Nothing new this week. Marcus, how about you?
Nothing's changed with me at all. Although, if I may trouble AM, because I did miss it earlier. Actually, no, never mind. I have nothing to shill. My notebook is closed. But thank you, everyone. And thank you, AM, for inviting me as always. A wonderful host. And I guess I'll catch everyone next time I'm invited. So thank you all.
All right. Well, thank you very much. In terms of again, what's next for the channel, we have a stream on Wednesday with Prudentialist. I'm gonna be talking about Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor. So very different period in time, but hopefully that'll be interesting. I want to get into the habit of thanking all my patrons who have lovingly subscribed over on Subscribestar. So thank you all, if you can see your name up there. Anyone who wants to be a Subscribestar patron, the link is in the description. If you like this content, please like and leave a comment or share. And thank you all for watching, and good night.
Thanks, everyone.